In 1989, a 22-year-old named Eloise Lindsay set out on a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian wilderness, hoping it would help her figure out what she wanted to do with her life. Instead, the trip would end with Eloise lost in the woods for nearly 3 weeks, convinced that something was following her through the trees. She had just graduated from college, a milestone that for many signals the start of a clear career path. But for Eloise, holding her degree felt less like a map and more like a blank page. She genuinely didn't know what she wanted to do next with her life. Being an experienced backpacker, she felt the call of the wilderness. She believed that a long, solitary journey through nature would give her the time and space she needed to think, to reflect, and to hopefully find some clarity. So she came up with a plan. When Eloise laid out this detailed plan for her parents, they weren't particularly concerned for her safety. They knew their daughter. They knew she was a capable and seasoned backpacker who had successfully completed similar trips before. They trusted her skills and her judgment. So, with their blessing, they wished her well and told her they'd see her when she got back. On November 4th, Eloise shouldered her pack and set out to begin her journey. The first couple of days were exactly what she had hoped for. The weather was beautiful, the autumn scenery along the trail was breathtaking, and the solitude was perfect. She had all the time in the world to be by herself, to look inward, and to think deeply about what her future might hold. But on the morning of the third day, everything changed. She woke up inside her tent, which she had pitched just off the trail the night before, and was immediately hit with an intense, overwhelming sense of dread. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling that she couldn't place. There was no obvious reason for it. She did a mental inventory, trying to figure out what was wrong. Had she forgotten a crucial piece of gear? Was there something about her route she was misremembering? But nothing came to mind. She tried to push the feeling aside, telling herself it was just a strange mood. She decided the best thing to do was to get moving, to pack up her camp and start hiking. She figured the physical activity and the change of scenery would help clear her head. So she unzipped her tent and stepped out into the cool morning air. As she began breaking down her campsite, she casually scanned the tree line. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, it was just a natural habit for a hiker, and that's when she saw it. She could have sworn she saw the figure of a man standing maybe 30 or 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. She blinked, doing a double take, and stared at the spot. It was broad daylight, and she was near a popular trail. The idea of seeing another person wasn't unbelievable in itself. But the way he was standing there, just watching, felt odd. When she looked again, the person was gone. She stood frozen for a minute, her eyes locked on the spot where she'd seen him. Was her mind playing tricks on her? Did she really see someone? If there was another hiker there, why were they hiding? Why wouldn't they just say hello? Out here in the relative wilderness, hikers usually acknowledged each other. But this person never showed themselves again. As she stood there trying to decide what to do, she felt a powerful, prickling sensation on the back of her neck. It was the distinct feeling of being watched. And it felt exactly like the sense of dread she had woken up with inside her tent. A chilling thought entered her mind. Was her intuition, her sixth sense, trying to warn her that she was being observed by a predator? She had no proof, no concrete evidence, but the feeling was undeniable. Alone in the middle of the woods, even an experienced hiker like Eloise couldn't help but feel incredibly vulnerable. The fact that this man, if he was real, wouldn't show himself again made her feel threatened. The feeling quickly escalated into panic. She abandoned any attempt at being neat and orderly and started stuffing her gear into her pack as fast as she could. Her hands were shaking. As soon as her pack was on her back, she took off down the trail, walking quickly away from the campsite and the man she saw in the woods. As she hurried along the path, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right behind her. She kept whipping her head around, her heart pounding, expecting to see someone there. But the trail behind her was always empty. Yet, that visceral feeling of being watched, that deep sense of dread, it just wouldn't go away. Her fast walk turned into a jog, and her jog turned into an all-out run. She realized she was in a very remote section of the trail, miles from any town or road. She was nowhere near her next planned stop. A new thought took hold of her. She had to get off this trail. She had to get to a road, to civilization, to safety, as quickly as humanly possible. She weighed her options. She could stay on the trail, but it would be many more miles and likely take her well into the night before she reached any kind of town. Or she could take a shortcut. She had a map, and she believed there was a road that ran parallel to the trail, but it was far down the mountain. Getting to it would mean leaving the marked path and bushwhacking through dense, unfamiliar wilderness. But the threat of the person or thing she felt was following her was so intense, so real to her, that she couldn't stand the idea of spending another night out in the woods being stalked. So she made a fateful decision. She stepped off the trail and started running straight down the steep, wooded mountainside. It wasn't long before she started to hear actual sounds coming from behind her. She was certain it was the person who was following her. She'd spin around, but there was never anyone there. She'd slow down, trying to listen as she walked, and she'd hear the distinct sound of footsteps in the leaves far behind her. Again, she'd turn and see nothing. But she was absolutely certain someone was back there stalking her. And then came a new sound. It was a low, guttural noise like a deep male voice, but it wasn't a language she could recognize. It was more like a grunt or a yell. Her heart rate soared. She was in full-blown panic now, crashing through the wilderness as fast as she could, praying she was headed towards the road. But after running for miles deep into the middle of nowhere, she hadn't found a road. The sun had set, and it was now completely dark. She knew she was hopelessly lost. She had no choice but to make camp. She knew that somewhere out there in the blackness of the woods was the person or thing that was hunting her. She was all alone, with no way to call for help. This was 1989, long before everyone carried a cell phone. With trembling hands, she set up her tent, crawled inside, zipped it up, and lay there, listening, hoping for silence. But sure enough, within minutes, she started to hear those sounds again. The low, audible grunts from somewhere in the forest. And then, the sound of heavy footsteps, walking in a wide circle around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she heard it. The footsteps never came right up to her tent. There was always some distance, but they were always there. Finally, the sun came up. The moment there was enough light to see, she scrambled out of her tent, packed it up in a frenzy, and started running again, desperately hoping she was moving in the direction of civilization. And all through that day, the terrifying cycle repeated. She had the constant sense that someone was watching her. She heard footsteps behind her, but saw nothing when she turned. She heard that low grunting voice from somewhere in the trees, but could never see who or what was making the sound. As the sun began to set again, she still hadn't found the road. She hadn't found a trail. She knew she couldn't even try to backtrack. If she turned around, she was bound to run straight into the very thing she was trying to escape. So once again, she found a spot to set up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She got inside her tent, and just like the night before, as soon as she was lying down, she heard the heavy footsteps circling in the woods and the low, audible sound that she couldn't place. A couple of days later, the day Eloise was supposed to meet her friend at the 7-day mark, she never showed up. Her friend waited at the rendezvous point for several hours, growing more and more concerned. Finally, when it was clear Eloise wasn't coming, her friend left the trail, found a phone, and contacted the authorities to file a missing person report. The police immediately launched a massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she was supposed to be. For the next 14 days, hundreds of police officers, search and rescue volunteers, and helicopters scoured the area. But they found no sign of Eloise at all. After 2 full weeks of searching, the police had to make the difficult decision to call off the official search. 2 days after the search was terminated, which was now 23 days after Eloise had first set off on her hike, a hunter was out in a remote area near the trail. He stumbled upon Eloise propped up against a tree. She was totally emaciated, severely dehydrated, and delirious, but she was alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter. In her confused state, she thought he was the person who had been following her. But when she finally realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was taken to a hospital, and aside from her severe dehydration and malnourishment, she was physically okay. In multiple interviews and in her official police statement, she detailed her terrifying ordeal. She insisted that she had been chased for nearly 3 weeks through the woods and that she had no idea who it was or why they were chasing her. Then she added another bizarre detail. She said that right before she was found, this person or thing that was following her got so close to her on a couple of occasions that she became absolutely terrified. She was so scared that she made a desperate choice. She ditched her backpack. Her backpack contained all of her life-saving equipment, her tent, her sleeping bag, her food and water. She threw it all away so she could be lighter, so she could run faster. Tapas. You have to imagine the level of fear a person would have to be in to willingly abandon the one thing they need to survive in the wilderness. After ditching her pack, with no supplies, no food, and no water, she stumbled across a tree in the middle of nowhere. And wedged inside a hollow in the trunk was a stash of donuts and pound cake. She took the food, and between that and water from a stream she found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before the hunter found her. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement was just as baffled. Some believe she may have had a mental break, that she got lost, and her paranoia created an imaginary pursuer. Others, including some park rangers familiar with that part of the trail, believe it's possible she was stalked by so-called wild men, feral people who are said to live deep in the mountains, according to local legend. But as of today, there is no official explanation for what happened to Eloise Lindsay. On the 7th of June, 1951, 2 families from Santa Fe, New Mexico, the McGees and the Crosses, decided to spend a beautiful day together. They met up at the Santa Fe ski basin for a picnic to enjoy the fresh mountain air. During the summer months, when there's no snow on the ground, the ski basin is a very popular spot for hikers. The terrain is rugged, and the views from the top are absolutely incredible. But on this particular day, the 2 families just wanted to have a relaxing picnic at the base of the mountain, looking up at the slopes. As the parents began unpacking the car and setting up the picnic site, the kids started playing together. There was Larry and Janet McGee, a brother and sister who were 7 and 5 years old, and their friend, 3-year-old Stephen Cross. After they had finished laying out the blanket and the food, the parents looked around and realized the kids were gone. They had just seen them playing nearby only a minute or 2 before, so they figured they couldn't have gone very far. They started looking around, calling out their names, but there was no answer. Their calls became a little more urgent as they began to worry. They expanded their search, looking farther and farther from the picnic spot. They realized the only place the children could have gone was up into the dense woods that bordered the area. But the terrain there was very steep and very rugged. It seemed impossible that 3 young children, one of them a toddler, could have gotten very far up the mountain. And they weren't responding to their parents' calls. A terrible thought began to creep in. Maybe they had been abducted. One of the parents ran to the main building of the ski resort where a staff member was on duty and used the phone to call the authorities. When the police arrived, they immediately set up huge, powerful spotlights and aimed them up at the mountain. The idea was that if the kids had somehow wandered up into the woods and gotten lost, they would see the bright lights and hopefully walk down towards them. After setting up the lights, the police began a thorough search of the mountainside, hoping that the children were simply lost and not the victims of a kidnapping. But despite the spotlights and hundreds of searchers yelling out the children's names, they heard nothing back. They found no sign of the kids. They searched all through the night, and as the hours passed, the grim possibility of an abduction seemed more and more likely. By the following afternoon, things were really starting to look bleak. There was still no sign of the kids anywhere. That's when a searcher, who was way outside of the primary search area, made a startling discovery. He was about 3.5 miles away from the picnic site and thousands of feet up in elevation. He was getting ready to leave his assigned section when he saw something out of the corner of his eye that looked like a person. He turned and saw one of the children poking their head up from behind a large, downed log. The searcher ran over, and sure enough, all 3 kids were huddled together inside the hollow log. They were dirty and scared, but they were all okay. As the searcher was picking them up and radioing in the incredible news, he couldn't help but wonder how in the world these 3 little kids had managed to get so far away and so high up the mountain. Once the children were brought back down to the search headquarters, reunited with their tearful parents and checked over by a doctor who confirmed they were okay, the police asked them the question on everyone's mind, how did you get all the way up there? Larry, the oldest of the group at 7 years old, was the one who answered. It took him a minute, but eventually he said that they had been playing near the picnic area and had wandered just a little way into the tree line. All of a sudden, he said, a bear came out from behind a tree and started chasing them. According to Larry, the 3 of them ran for their lives 3.5 miles up a steep mountain until they found the log, which they jumped inside of to hide. He claimed the bear was patrolling the area looking for them. But then Larry added another detail. He said that in addition to the bear, they were especially scared of the gorilla that was also walking around the area looking for them too. Now, it's easy to dismiss a child's story. You could say the gorilla they saw was just one of the searchers. But there were no searchers in that specific remote area near the log until the exact moment they were found. It was a last-ditch effort to expand the search, and it was a miracle they were located at all. Larry insisted that he and the other kids saw the gorilla and the bear on the first day and during the first night, long before any search teams were that far up the mountain. As for the bear, sightings in the Santa Fe ski basin are rare, but not unheard of. However, if a real bear had been chasing 3 small children, it would have caught them. There's no way 3 kids, especially a 3-year-old, could outrun a bear going uphill. So either there wasn't a bear or it was some other animal that just looked like a bear to them. But even if you discount the animals entirely and say the kids just got lost, there's still the problem of the distance. To cover 3.5 miles uphill through extremely rugged mountain terrain is an incredible feat for a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. For a 3-year-old, it's practically impossible to do in a 2-4-hour period without help. The only way it might be possible is if the children were in absolute fear for their lives. The adrenaline rush from that kind of terror could potentially give them the strength and endurance to cover that distance. This lends a strange credibility to their story that they were, in fact, running for their lives. But what were they running from? A bear? A gorilla? We'll likely never know. Because the children were found alive and safe, the case was closed and everyone moved on. From 2002 to 2006, Cullen Finnerty was a force to be reckoned with in college football. He was arguably one of the most successful college quarterbacks in history, leading his team to 3 national championships and being named the Division II Player of the Decade. He was also known for being one of the toughest players on the field. Most quarterbacks are trained to avoid big hits, to slide or run out of bounds. Not Cullen. He stood 6'2", weighed 240 pounds, and he would tell his teammates that he actually wanted to get hit and that he would hit back. His coaches hated it, but his teammates loved his fearless, aggressive style. Cullen was also famous for playing through injuries. During his junior year in college, he broke his collarbone but didn't tell anyone. He played through an entire playoff series with the injury and still led his team to victory. After college, however, Cullen's professional football career didn't reach the same heights. He had brief stints with two NFL teams, the Baltimore Ravens and the Denver Broncos, but he didn't get much playing time. He could see the writing on the wall. He wasn't going to make it in the NFL. So he left for Europe to play in the European Football League. But when that career also began to sputter out around 2009, he came back to the United States and joined a very small-time indoor arena football league. Cullen's passion for the game was still as strong as ever, but he knew that playing at this level meant his career was effectively over. Around the same time he was hanging up his football cleats for good, he met a woman named Jennifer who would become his wife. She was an all-state volleyball player, and in many ways, she was just as competitive and athletic as Cullen. They were a perfect match. They got married in 2010, and Cullen, this big, tough quarterback, was shaking and crying at the altar. He was so nervous and excited about marrying Jennifer. It was a huge turning point for him, a moment where he was consciously putting his football past behind him to start a new life and build a family. The newlyweds moved into a house in Michigan, had 2 children, and Cullen landed a good job in medical sales. By all accounts, Cullen was thriving in his life after football. On Memorial Day weekend in 2013, Jennifer's family planned a 3-day fishing trip along the Baldwin River in Michigan. Cullen and Jennifer decided to join them with their kids. They rented a cabin near the campsite where Jennifer's family was staying. The whole weekend was wonderful. The weather was perfect, everyone was having a great time fishing and relaxing. On May 26th, the last night of the trip, Cullen, who had recently bought a new pontoon boat that he was incredibly proud of, wanted to go out one last time. He just wanted to fish for another 30 or 45 minutes before they packed up and ended the weekend. So Cullen put on his fishing waders and his jacket, grabbed his fishing pole, and had his family drive him to the set of stairs that led down to the water where his boat was docked. Before he walked down the steps, he turned and told his family he'd be out for about 30 to 45 minutes. He told them to pick him up at the next boat ramp downriver and that he would call them when he was ready. 42 minutes later, at 9:27 p.m., Jennifer's phone rang. It was Cullen. She expected him to say he was ready to be picked up. But when she answered, Cullen's voice was frantic. He told her that he was being followed by 2 men. He said he was out on the water in his pontoon boat, but there were 2 men in the tree line on the shore. He said he couldn't see them, but he could hear them, and they had been following him for some time. Before Jennifer could even process what he was saying and ask a question, Cullen said something incredibly strange. He told her he was going to beach the boat and take his clothes off. Then he hung up. Jennifer immediately tried calling him back over and over, but he didn't pick up. She was left feeling totally shocked and confused. What stood out most to her was the raw fear in his voice. Fear was not an emotion she associated with Cullen. This was a man who was a beast on the football field, who seemed fearless. For him to sound that scared and to be talking about people stalking him, she knew he was in serious trouble. She immediately called 911, described where he was on the Baldwin River, and the police said they would send someone out right away. After getting off the phone with the police, Jennifer called her family and told them about the bizarre and terrifying phone call from Cullen. Her brother, Matt, decided to try calling Cullen himself. This time, Cullen answered. Matt asked him, "Cullen, where are you?" Cullen replied, "I don't know where I am, but there's these 2 guys that are still following me." Matt tried to get more information, asking if he was still on his boat or if he was on land. All Cullen said was, "It's getting pretty rough out here," and then he hung up again. Matt called Jennifer and told her about the call, but it didn't provide any clarity. So Jennifer and her family decided the best thing to do was to drive to the boat ramp where Cullen had originally said he wanted to be picked up. They hoped he might somehow make his way there. When they arrived, Cullen was nowhere to be seen. They got out of their car and yelled his name into the darkness, but there was no response. Shortly after, a police car pulled up. This was one of the locations Jennifer had mentioned to the 911 operator. The police officer took an official statement from Jennifer, and at that point they filed an official missing person report for Cullen Finnerty. Before starting the physical search, the police contacted Cullen's wireless service provider and asked them to ping his cell phone. A service provider can roughly triangulate a phone's location based on which cell towers it's connecting to. The results they got back were bizarre. The last 4 locations that were pinged for Cullen's phone were up to 4 miles apart from each other. This was strange because the idea that Cullen could have covered that much ground, moving 4, 5, or even 7 miles in a short amount of time through very rugged wooded terrain, didn't seem possible. What was even stranger was that when police looked at these 4 points on a map, each one was either right next to a paved road or would have required him to cross a paved road to get there. If he was lost and scared, why would he keep crossing roads, which represented safety, and plunging back into the wilderness? As strange as the data was, it gave the police a solid starting point. They dispatched search teams to each of the 4 locations and also began combing the banks of the river where he was last seen. Within an hour, they found his boat. It was beached on the side of the river, a little ways downstream from where he had been dropped off. It was missing an oar. It wasn't clear if it had been intentionally beached or had just drifted ashore. Cullen was not in it, and a search of the immediate area found no sign of him. Interestingly, a man who owned property near where the boat was found told police he heard screaming or yelling coming from that area around the same time Cullen went missing. For the next 48 hours, police and hundreds of volunteers searched the areas where his phone had pinged and along the river, but there was no sign of him. Then, on the evening of May 28th, approximately 48 hours after he went missing, they found his body. He was located less than half a mile from a paved road in an area situated between the 4 cell phone ping locations. He was lying face down, his right arm tucked under his body, and his left arm over his head, clutching a handful of grass. When they rolled him over, he had some blood coming from his nose, but other than that, there was no sign of significant trauma anywhere on his body. He appeared to be fully clothed, but investigators noted that the strap on his waders was badly twisted. This was a significant detail. A twisted strap like that would have been very uncomfortable, something a person would almost certainly fix before starting a fishing trip. This, combined with the bizarre statement he made to his wife about taking his clothes off, led some to speculate that at some point during his ordeal, his clothes had come off and had been put back on again in a hurry, either by him or by someone else. His cell phone was found in his front pocket. Cullen's initial autopsy was inconclusive. There was no obvious cause of death. Later, a more detailed analysis determined he had died of pneumonia caused by inhaling his own vomit. Many people believe Cullen's death was a tragic result of CTE, a brain injury caused by the years of repeated head trauma from playing football. CTE can lead to paranoia and confusion. Perhaps he had a severe paranoid episode, believed someone was chasing him, got lost and scared, and in his panicked state, somehow ended up dying. There was a minor incident in 2011 where Cullen had briefly thought someone was following him, but it had passed. But even if it was a fit of paranoia, why didn't he stop when he reached the paved roads? A road represents help and safety. His instinct should have been to seek help, not to run back into the woods. And why did he leave the safety of his boat in the first place? On the other hand, if he really was being followed, why would his pursuers allow him to make phone calls? Why would they prompt him to take his clothes off? It makes no sense. Both theories are full of holes, leaving a tragic and profound mystery. Thank you so much for watching. What makes stories like these so unsettling is that they don't feel impossible. Even today, people still disappear in forests, national parks, and remote wilderness areas under circumstances nobody can fully explain. And in all three of these cases, the victims described the exact same terrifying feeling that something was following them just beyond the trees. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe out in places where there are no cameras, no witnesses, and no help for miles around, there really was someone or something out there with them. Let me know what you think in the comments. And the next time you find yourself completely alone in the woods and suddenly get the feeling that you're being watched, you might want to trust that feeling. One afternoon in September of 1951, a 53-year-old father named Adolphus Eller pulled his car up to a boarding house in the city of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He got out, went to the trunk, and lifted out a large cardboard box filled with his daughter's belongings. He carried it up the steps, through the front door, and down a hallway to a room where his two 21-year-old daughters were already busy unpacking. Their names were Bobby and Betty. For the two young women, this was the most exciting day of their lives. They were moving out of their childhood home in the small, quiet town of Pearl Lear, about an hour's drive away. It was the first time they would be living on their own, away from their father, Adolphus, and their mother. They had both gotten jobs at the same cigarette factory, a major employer in the area, and they were going to be sharing this room together in the boarding house. It was a huge step for them, the real beginning of their adult lives. You could see the excitement just radiating off of them as they put their clothes into drawers and decided where to hang their pictures. But for their dad, Adolphus, the moment was bittersweet. On the one hand, he was incredibly proud. His girls were growing up, making their own way in the world. That's all any parent wants. But on the other hand, it was hard to let go. They were his little girls. He watched them for a moment, chattering and laughing, and felt a familiar mix of pride and sadness. Even though they were leaving the nest, he took comfort in one very important fact. They were still together. They were living together, working at the same place. He knew that even if he and their mom couldn't be there every day to look after them, they would always have each other. And that made him feel like they would be okay. You see, Bobby and Betty were not just sisters. They were identical twins. And their bond was deeper and more intense than most people could ever really understand. It went far beyond just being close siblings. They had a connection that seemed to defy normal explanation. They leaned into their identity as twins in every possible way. Physically, they were almost impossible to tell apart. Both stood at 5 feet 3 inches tall, with round faces and dark hair, which they always made sure to style in the exact same way. If one got a new haircut, the other would be in the salon the very next day getting the same one. But it went so much deeper than just their appearance. Their personalities and interests were almost perfectly mirrored, to a point that it sometimes seemed deliberate, almost forced. Both were social and outgoing. Both played the piano beautifully. They sang together in the school glee club. They both got good grades. It was as if they were two halves of a single person. But then there were the things they shared that just didn't seem possible. For example, they had a strange habit of getting sick at the exact same time, even with illnesses that weren't contagious. There was one instance that Adolphus and his wife never forgot. Bobby had developed a painful abscess on one of her teeth. She was genuinely sick from it, with a fever and a swollen jaw. It was a serious infection. Then, completely out of the blue, Betty developed an abscess in the very same tooth. The doctors couldn't explain it. This wasn't something you could fake or imagine. It was a real physical ailment that she had developed at the exact same moment as her twin sister. It was just one of many examples of their strange, unexplainable connection. And on the rare occasions when some difference was forced upon them, they would work very intentionally to erase that difference and become the same again. When Bobby's eyesight started to fail and she needed glasses, she was a little self-conscious about it. Betty, whose vision was perfectly fine, begged her parents to let her get glasses too. She didn't need them, but she couldn't stand the idea of being different from her sister in any way. So, she got a pair of glasses with plain lenses, just so they could look identical again. So now, this big move to Winston-Salem was just the next chapter in their shared life. The same job, the same factory, the same room, in the same boarding house. It was how they had always done things. A part of Adolphus and his wife had secretly hoped that as they got older, Bobby and Betty might start to become a little more independent of each other. It just seemed like the healthy, natural thing to do. But as he put down that last box and looked at his two daughters, both with the same wide, excited smile on their faces, he felt a wave of gratitude. Maybe this was for the best. This was a good intermediate step. They could take this leap into adulthood together, leaning on each other. It was a bridge. After a few more minutes of helping them get settled, Adolphus knew it was time to go. He gave them both a long hug and said, "Okay, I'm going to take off now. Best of luck. I love you both. Call whenever you need anything." And with that, he walked out, got in his car, and began the quiet, lonely drive back home. Fast forward 2 years. Adolphus was at home in Pearl Lear, setting the dining room table while his wife finished cooking dinner in the kitchen. It was a weekend, and Adolphus felt that familiar sense of happy anticipation. For the past 2 years, without fail, Bobby and Betty had driven home from Winston-Salem every single weekend to visit. It was the highlight of the week for Adolphus and his wife. They cherished this time with their daughters, hearing all about their jobs and their new lives. Just as Adolphus placed the last dinner plate on the table, he heard a knock at the front door. He smiled to himself. Right on time. "They're here," he called to his wife. He walked to the door, ready to greet both of his girls, but when he opened it, he was surprised. It was just Bobby. Betty was nowhere in sight. He looked past her, toward the driveway, expecting to see Betty getting out of the car. He asked, "Where's Betty? Is she in the car?" Bobby just shook her head and said no. That's when Adolphus noticed that Bobby had luggage with her, a couple of suitcases, and she looked terribly sad. Her usual bright expression was gone, replaced by a look of deep unhappiness, almost depression. "Bobby, what's going on?" he asked, his heart starting to sink. She looked down at the ground and said quietly, "I hated my job at the factory. I hated it. So I quit. I'm coming home." Adolphus was stunned. This was a huge shift. The twins did everything together. They always had. Even if one of them wasn't particularly interested in something, she would usually go along with it just to maintain their sameness. The idea that one would quit this big new life they had built together while the other stayed was a massive departure from their entire history. Adolphus tried to process it. "And Betty?" he asked. "She doesn't hate her job. She's going to stay. She's going to keep working at the factory and living there." The news was jarring. But then he shifted focus back to the immediate situation. "Okay, well, of course you can stay here. Of course you can come home. But where's Betty? Is she coming to visit this weekend? Even if she's still working, she's still coming for the weekend, right?" Again, Bobby shook her head. "No. She's staying in Winston-Salem this weekend." This was another shock. They had never missed a weekend visit. It just felt like the world had tilted on its axis. What was going on with his girls? But Adolphus pushed his confusion aside. His daughter was hurting. He put his arm around her and said, "Look, just come on in. Have some dinner. Get settled. We'll talk about this. We'll figure out what your next steps are. Of course, you can stay here. Everything will be fine." Bobby picked up her bags and stepped inside. But as her mother came out to greet her, Bobby just said she wasn't hungry and didn't want to eat. Then she walked straight up to her old bedroom, brought her things inside, and shut the door. She didn't come out again that night. And for the next 2 years, that's mostly where Bobby stayed. In her bedroom, the door was almost always closed. She rarely left the room, and when she did, it was just for brief trips to the bathroom or to get a glass of water, and then she would retreat right back into her sanctuary. She had almost completely shut down. She never explained to her parents what she hated so much about the factory job. She never talked about anything, really. The social, extroverted girl they knew had vanished. In her place was a recluse. She didn't try to reconnect with any of her old friends from high school. She didn't look for a new job or show any interest in her future. It was as if her life had just stopped. She was just existing, day after day, inside those four walls. But there was one thing that could bring the old Bobby back, if only for a little while. And that was when Betty came home to visit on the weekends. The moment Betty walked through the front door, it was like a switch was flipped. Bobby would emerge from her room, her face would light up, and she would instantly become her old self again. The two of them would fall right back into their old rhythm, laughing and talking as if no time had passed. There was no resentment, no awkwardness about the fact that their lives had taken such different paths. For those 2 days, everything was normal again. And then, Sunday evening would come, Betty would leave to go back to her job and her life in Winston-Salem, and Bobby would walk back into her bedroom and shut the door. The light would go out again. For Adolphus and his wife, it was agonizing to watch. They had always hoped their daughters would find some independence. But now it seemed that while Betty was managing to do okay on her own, Bobby was completely falling apart without her sister. She was utterly dependent on Betty for her happiness, for her very sense of self. It was so clear. Adolphus didn't know how this could ever be resolved. It just seemed to be getting worse and worse for Bobby as time went on. Then, around the 2-year mark of Bobby being home, something else unexpected happened. Betty came home one Friday for her usual weekend visit. But this time, she had luggage with her, just like Bobby had 2 years prior. She walked in and announced, "I quit the factory too. I'm moving back home." In a strange way, Adolphus and his wife felt a sense of relief. Their first thought was for Bobby. This had to be a good thing for her. With Betty home for good, surely Bobby would return to her normal self. They had seen how happy she was every time Betty visited. Maybe now that happiness would be permanent. But there was also a sense of unease. It just didn't make sense for Betty to quit her job. She seemed to like it. She seemed to be thriving on her own. Adolphus couldn't prove it, but he had a strong suspicion about what was really happening. He believed Betty was making a sacrifice. She was giving up her independent life to come home and be with her sister, to fall back into step with her just like they always did. It seemed like the only explanation. Still, the silver lining was that maybe, just maybe, their daughters would be happy and healthy again. But that is not what happened. Once Betty was back home, the two sisters did fall back in step with each other, just as their parents had predicted. But it wasn't a return to their old happy selves. Their connection, their dependence on each other, became more extreme than it had ever been before. And it had already been extreme. This was something else entirely. They both moved into Bobby's old bedroom. They went inside, shut the door, and basically never came out. They didn't become the extroverted girls they used to be. Instead, they became introverted together. They showed no interest in finding jobs, socializing with friends, or doing anything at all. They just stayed in that room, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They slept in the same bed. On the rare occasions they did leave the bedroom, they were physically inseparable. They would walk side by side, their shoulders touching. They moved in perfect sync, almost like robots. If one went to the kitchen, the other went too. If one went to the bathroom, the other went with her. They could not be apart, not even for a second. It was a level of attachment that their parents had never seen before, and it was deeply unsettling. Adolphus and his wife were terrified. They didn't even have a name for what they were witnessing. It was codependency on a level that seemed pathological. They kept hoping that it was just a phase, that the girls would eventually level out and get their lives back on track. But then it got even worse. On top of everything else, they stopped eating. At first, it was just occasional. Adolphus would go up to the bedroom at dinner time and knock on the door. It would open just a crack, and both Bobby's and Betty's faces would appear in the gap, looking out at him. Adolphus would say, "Hey, dinner's on the table. Are you coming down to eat?" And the girls, without even looking at each other, would respond in perfect, eerie unison, "We're not hungry." Then they would shut the door. It happened night after night. Weeks went by, and the girls were refusing almost all food. They began to lose a shocking amount of weight. Their faces became gaunt, their bodies frail. But no matter how much their parents begged and pleaded with them, they just would not eat. After a few weeks of this, Adolphus and his wife knew they couldn't handle this on their own. Logic wasn't working. Pleading wasn't working. There was something deeply wrong, and it seemed increasingly obvious that it was a serious mental health issue. They made the difficult decision to seek professional help. They brought Bobby and Betty to see a psychiatrist. After several sessions with the twins, the psychiatrist gave them a diagnosis. He said that both Bobby and Betty had schizophrenia, a very serious and chronic brain disorder that can dramatically affect a person's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. The psychiatrist explained that many of their strange behaviors, particularly their extreme codependency and their refusal to eat, could be symptoms of this illness. He prescribed them both powerful antipsychotic medication and assured Adolphus and his wife that if the twins took their medicine as directed, they would get better. The parents felt a glimmer of hope. Finally, they had an answer and a path forward. They made sure Bobby and Betty took their medication every single day, exactly as prescribed. But the twins didn't get any better. In fact, they seemed to get worse. They spent even more time locked in their bedroom. They became even more frail. And they started showing signs of extreme paranoia. They were mistrustful of everyone, including their own parents. It was as if the only person in the world each of them could trust was the other. Anyone else was a threat. Pretty quickly, Adolphus realized the medication wasn't working. He didn't necessarily doubt the diagnosis. The symptoms of schizophrenia seemed to fit what he was seeing. But the treatment was failing. He decided they needed more intensive help, a higher level of care. So, in early 1961, when Bobby and Betty were now 30 years old, Adolphus made the heartbreaking decision to have them both involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. At first, it seemed to be exactly what they needed. At the hospital, they were monitored around the clock. The staff made sure they ate their meals, so they started to gain weight back. They were given proper medication under professional supervision. And, crucially, the hospital staff allowed them to stay in the same room together. They were never separated, and having each other for support seemed to be a key part of their recovery. After several weeks, they were deemed healthy enough to be discharged. They seemed to be back to their old selves. But almost as soon as they got back to their family home, they regressed. They went right back to their bedroom, shut the door, and the whole destructive cycle started all over again. The seclusion, the not eating, the paranoia. And so, they were committed to the hospital again. And again, they got better while they were there. And again, they were discharged. And again, they got worse as soon as they were home. This pattern repeated over and over again for more than a year. They were in and out of the hospital, trapped in a loop with no real progress being made. Eventually, Adolphus, his wife, and the team of doctors and nurses who had been treating the twins came to a difficult and controversial conclusion. They started to wonder if the root of the problem wasn't schizophrenia at all. Maybe the schizophrenia was a symptom of a deeper issue. Maybe the problem was their intense, all-consuming dependency on each other. What had once seemed like a beautiful, timeless bond between sisters was now being viewed as a deeply unhealthy, pathological codependency. They were so enmeshed with each other that neither of them could function as an individual. They were stuck, and unless some drastic action was taken, they would continue this downward spiral indefinitely. And so, a decision was made. A radical, last-ditch effort to save them. Without telling the girls, the doctors and their parents agreed that they had to be forcibly separated. And so, on the 11th of April, 1962, Bobby and Betty were once again committed to the hospital. But this time was different. For the very first time in their lives, they were separated. They were put in rooms at opposite ends of the hospital in completely separate wards. When they realized what was happening, they completely lost their minds. They begged, they screamed, they cried, demanding to be put back together. But the staff held firm, telling them it was for their own good. A few hours later, in the dead of night, it was around 1 a.m. on April 12th. Adolphus was at home, asleep in his bed. The phone rang, jolting him awake. He was confused. Who would be calling at this hour? He picked it up and heard the voice of one of the hospital doctors on the other end. The doctor sounded frantic, his voice shaking. He was trying to explain to Adolphus what had happened after the girls were separated, but the words were tumbling out in a jumbled, panicked mess. Adolphus couldn't make sense of it. He kept asking, "What are you talking about? What happened?" Finally, the doctor took a deep breath, paused, and then very clearly stated the unbelievable, disastrous thing that had unfolded. It was something no one could have ever planned for, something the doctor himself couldn't comprehend. As Adolphus listened, he just sat there on the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear, completely frozen, unable to process the words he was hearing. Over the next few days, the doctors at that psychiatric hospital tried to find a rational, scientific explanation for what had happened on the night Bobby and Betty were separated. They couldn't. They were completely baffled. So, they called in the North Carolina State Board of Investigators for help. The investigators came, they looked at all the evidence, and they couldn't figure it out either. So, they called in the FBI. The federal agents reviewed the case, and they too were stumped. Nobody had any idea how this could have happened. As the story inevitably leaked to the press, it became a national sensation. Newspapers all over the country ran articles about the unbelievable mystery of the Eller twins. And as people read the story, many began to wonder if the explanation wasn't rooted in science at all. Maybe what had happened was something beyond our human understanding. Something that science couldn't measure or explain, but that didn't make it any less real. It turns out that at 12:55 a.m. on the night the twins were separated, a nurse in the ward where Bobby had been placed was doing her regular rounds. When she got to Bobby's room, she looked in and saw Bobby lying in her bed, on her side. The nurse thought she was asleep, but when she went to check on her, she discovered that Bobby was dead. Just 5 minutes later, at exactly 1 a.m., a doctor went to check on Betty in her room on the complete other side of the hospital. The doctor found Betty dead in her bed, lying in the exact same position as her sister. The most baffling part was that there was no obvious cause of death for either of them. There were no signs of illness, no signs of self-harm, no signs of foul play or violence of any kind. It was as if, at almost the exact same moment, both of their bodies had simply decided to stop working. Even after multiple thorough autopsies were performed, no medical reason for their deaths could be found. They hadn't been poisoned. They didn't have heart attacks or strokes. Medically speaking, they were healthy one moment and dead the next. The only conclusion anyone could draw was that the twins had died simultaneously from no apparent cause. Their official cause of death was listed as ill-defined and unknown. The only theory that ever emerged came from one of the doctors who had treated them. He believed that Bobby and Betty were so deeply distressed by being forcibly separated that they had found a way to reunite. He suggested that they had, in his words, willed themselves to die. He proposed that their spiritual, physical, and emotional need to be together was so powerful that when it was taken away, their bodies simply shut down in the hope that their spirits could reconnect in death. It's a wild, unbelievable theory. But there is one final strange detail about the way they died that seems to lend it a chilling layer of credibility. It suggests that whatever happened that night was something truly beyond our comprehension. When the staff found Bobby and Betty's bodies just 5 minutes apart on opposite ends of the hospital, they weren't just lying in the same position. They were positioned on their beds in a slightly awkward, unnatural way. You know how a bed is a rectangle, and you normally lie on it vertically, parallel to the long sides. Well, the girls were found lying at a slight angle on their respective beds. At first, it was just noted as a strange anomaly. But then, someone had a thought. They imagined what it would look like if you could remove all the walls of the hospital. If you could see from Bobby's room all the way down the corridors to Betty's room, and when they mapped it out, they realized the strange angle wasn't random at all. The way the girls had positioned themselves on their beds meant that through all those walls and all that distance, they were looking directly at each other at the moment they died. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 1957, in the quiet, hard-working town of Akron, Ohio, a 31-year-old man named Larry Bader was trying his best to build a good life. He had a wife, Mary Lou, and 3 young kids who were his entire world. By all accounts, Larry was a wonderful father and a loving husband. He was the kind of guy who would do anything for his family. But there was one area where Larry consistently struggled, and that was business. He had the heart of an entrepreneur, always brimming with new ideas and big dreams. Over the years, he had poured his energy and what little money they had into one venture after another. But each one, for one reason or another, had failed to take off. These failures left the Bader family in a deep hole of debt. And so, Larry had to put his entrepreneurial dreams on the shelf. He couldn't afford to take any more risks. He needed a steady paycheck to keep a roof over his family's head and food on the table. He took a job as a cookware salesman for a local company. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't his passion, but it paid the bills. The work was a daily reminder of his failed ambitions, and it wore on him. To escape the pressure and the quiet disappointment of his life, Larry had found a sanctuary. That sanctuary was Lake Erie, about an hour's drive north of their home. On the weekends, if Mary Lou was okay with managing the kids on her own, Larry would pack up his gear and his small boat and just disappear. Out on the water with a fishing line in his hand, he could disconnect from the bills, from the sales quotas, and from the life he felt he was supposed to be living. It was his way of resetting, of finding a small piece of peace. On Friday, the 15th of March, 1957, Larry came to his wife with his usual weekend request. He told her he really needed to get away, to head up to the lake and do some fishing. Mary Lou, as always, was supportive. She knew how much he needed these trips. But this time, she was worried. She told him she had heard the weather forecast, and it wasn't good. A big storm was supposed to roll in over the lake. She asked him if he was sure it was a good idea to go. Larry just smiled and waved it off. He told her not to worry, that the news always exaggerated these things. He said the storms were never as bad as they predicted, and he would be perfectly fine. And so, with that reassurance, he kissed Mary Lou goodbye, he kissed each of his 3 children, grabbed his fishing gear, and headed out the door. He hopped in his truck and drove north towards the calm, gray waters of Lake Erie. That night, the storm that Mary Lou had worried about crashed down on Lake Erie with a vengeance. It was far worse than anyone had predicted. The winds howled, and the rain came down in sheets, turning the lake's surface into a violent, churning mess. The following morning, as the storm began to subside, the Coast Guard was out on patrol, surveying the damage. And that's when they found it. A small boat, bobbing aimlessly in the waves. It was Larry Bader's boat. They pulled up alongside it and saw that it had some minor damage, like it had been battered around by the storm. One of the oars was missing. And so was Larry. A massive search was launched immediately. The Coast Guard scoured the lake and the shoreline for days, hoping to find any sign of him. But there was nothing. Larry Bader had simply vanished into the storm. After weeks of searching turned up no body and no new clues, the authorities had to make a difficult call. Larry Bader was officially declared dead, lost to the unforgiving waters of Lake Erie. His family, though they had no body to bury, held a funeral to say their goodbyes. Mary Lou was devastated, but she had to be strong for her children. She cashed in Larry's life insurance policy. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough to pay off their debts and give her and the kids a chance to start over, to build a new life without their father and husband. Fast forward 8 long years to 1965. Life had moved on for the Bader family. Larry's niece, a 21-year-old woman named Suzanne Pekka, was in Chicago for a sporting goods show. She was with a friend, and they were wandering through the massive convention hall, looking at all the latest fishing rods, camping gear, and hunting equipment. As they walked, they noticed a large crowd gathered around one of the exhibits off to the side. Curious, they decided to see what all the excitement was about. They worked their way through the group of people until they could see what was happening in the center. There, a man was putting on an archery demonstration. He had a big, thick mustache and was wearing a black eye patch over one eye. He stood with a confident posture, holding a bow, and was methodically shooting arrows at a target about 30 feet away. Suzanne and her friend watched for a few minutes, and it quickly became clear why this man had drawn such a crowd. He was an incredible archer. Arrow after arrow flew from his bow and landed squarely in the bullseye. He almost never missed. It was a mesmerizing display of skill. As they stood there watching, Suzanne's friend started looking more closely at the archer, not just at his skill, but at his face. After a moment, he turned to Suzanne with a strange look. He said to her, "Hey, doesn't that guy look exactly like your uncle? The one who disappeared on Lake Erie?" Suzanne was taken aback. Her Uncle Larry had been gone for 8 years, and it was strange to hear him mentioned so suddenly. But she turned her gaze back to the man with the eye patch, and this time she looked at him differently. And then she saw it. The resemblance was uncanny. Even with the mustache and the eye patch, the shape of his face, his build, the way he carried himself, it was a spitting image of her Uncle Larry. And then another piece clicked into place in her mind. Her Uncle Larry had also been known for being a phenomenal archer. It was one of his favorite hobbies. Here was a man who looked just like him and had the exact same rare talent. The coincidence felt too big to ignore. As soon as the demonstration ended and the crowd started to thin out, Suzanne and her friend rushed over to the man. Suzanne's heart was pounding. She walked right up to him and said, "I know this is going to sound crazy, but you look exactly like my uncle, Larry Bader. He went missing on Lake Erie 8 years ago." The man looked at her, and a polite, slightly confused smile crossed his face. He told her he was sorry, but he didn't know anyone named Larry Bader. He said his name was John Johnson, but everyone called him Fritz. He repeated that he was sorry, but he couldn't help her. But Suzanne wasn't convinced. The more she looked at him, the more certain she became. The denial didn't shake her. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, you are Larry Bader. I am positive you're my uncle." At this point, Fritz's politeness started to wear a little thin. He was firm, but not rude. He reiterated that he was not her uncle. He told her he didn't know who Larry Bader was, that he'd never been to Lake Erie. He tried to explain his life to her, to show her how impossible it was. He said he lived in Omaha, Nebraska, with his wife and his kids. He told her he was a sports journalist on television in Omaha and also worked as a consultant for archery companies, which is why he was at the show. He looked at her, completely bewildered, and said he just didn't understand why she thought he was her uncle, but he wasn't. And with that, Fritz turned and walked away, leaving Suzanne and her friends standing there in shock. But they were not deterred. Not in the slightest. They were now more convinced than ever that this man was Larry Bader, and he was either lying or something very strange was going on. They ran to find a payphone. Suzanne called her 2 other uncles Larry's brothers. She frantically explained what had just happened, how she had found a man who was the spitting image of their long-lost brother. Her uncles were skeptical at first, but the conviction in Suzanne's voice was enough. They told her to stay put. They booked the next flight to Chicago and flew out that very night. The next morning, Suzanne and her friend met her two uncles at the sporting goods show. They all went straight to the archery exhibit. And sure enough, there he was. Fritz Johnson, with his eye patch and mustache, doing another one of his incredible archery demonstrations. They waited patiently until there was a break. Then the four of them, Suzanne, her friend, and Larry Bader's two brothers, walked over to him. As soon as the brothers saw Fritz up close, any doubt they might have had vanished. Despite the eye patch, despite the mustache, despite the 8 years that had passed, they knew this was their brother. They approached him calmly. One of the brothers spoke, telling him that they knew he was saying he wasn't Larry, but the resemblance was just too strong to be a coincidence. He explained that they had been searching for their brother for a very long time. Then he pulled out some papers. He told Fritz that they had Larry's old military records, which included a full set of his fingerprints. He asked Fritz, "Please, just humor us. Come with us to the police station and get your fingerprints taken. It's the only way to prove to us that you aren't our brother." It would be a huge favor and would finally give them some closure. Fritz was clearly annoyed. He didn't want to do it. This whole thing was a ridiculous distraction. But he looked at the hopeful, desperate faces of these strangers and sighed. He figured it was the quickest way to end this bizarre situation. He said, "Fine. I'll go to the police station. I'll get my fingerprints taken, and then we can all put this behind us." And so, later that day, they all left the sporting goods show and went to a local Chicago police station. Fritz Johnson sat patiently while an officer rolled his fingertips in ink and pressed them onto a card. The officer then took the new prints and compared them with the ones from Larry Bader's military file. After a few minutes of careful examination, the officer looked up at Fritz, and he told him, "You are Larry Bader." When Fritz heard those words, he was in a state of pure disbelief. It wasn't a moment of revelation for him. No flood of lost memories came rushing back. In fact, it was the exact opposite. His mind was a blank slate when it came to Larry Bader. He immediately started trying to make sense of it, racking his brain, searching for any inconsistency in his own memory, any clue that his life as Fritz Johnson wasn't real, but he found nothing. All he could remember was a continuous, unbroken life. He had memories of being a young child named Fritz Johnson, growing up and living his life all the way up to that present moment in the police station. But now he was being told that the vast majority of those memories were a complete fabrication. He was never a child named Fritz Johnson. He was Larry Bader, a man from Ohio, and he had only become Fritz Johnson 8 years ago. The timeline of what actually happened is still murky, but investigators were able to piece together a rough sketch. It seems that just a few days, or maybe a few months, after Larry Bader disappeared on Lake Erie, a man calling himself Fritz Johnson showed up in Omaha, Nebraska. He walked into a local restaurant and asked for a job. He provided documents that seemed to prove his identity, and nobody had any reason to question him. He seemed like a completely normal, friendly guy. There was nothing about his behavior that raised any red flags. Over the next 8 years, Fritz wove himself into the very fabric of the Omaha community. He got married to a woman there. He had a child with her and adopted another. He was a good husband and a good father. He eventually left his job as a bartender and, through his charisma and talent, landed an amazing job as a sports broadcaster for the local television station. In Omaha, Fritz Johnson was a minor celebrity. People recognized him on the street. They'd wave and say, "Hey, Fritz, how are you doing?" He had built a full, successful, and happy life from scratch. But as soon as the news broke that he was actually Larry Bader, that carefully constructed life came crashing down around him. The television station he worked for fired him immediately. His second wife, the woman in Omaha, left him. It turned out their marriage had never been legally valid in the first place because Larry Bader was still legally married to his first wife, Mary Lou, and to make matters worse, the insurance company that had paid out the life insurance policy to Mary Lou all those years ago now demanded that the money be repaid in full. Throughout this entire chaotic ordeal, as his world fell apart, Fritz continued to insist that he was not Larry Bader. He was convinced it was all a huge, unexplainable mistake. He simply could not comprehend how any of this could have happened. It made no sense to him. Eventually, a team of experts, including doctors and psychologists, was brought in to examine him. They put him through nearly 2 weeks of intensive tests and evaluations. At the end of it all, they came to 2 firm conclusions. First, there was no doubt whatsoever that he was, in fact, Larry Bader. The physical evidence was undeniable. And second, he was almost certainly suffering from an extreme and profound case of amnesia, a total loss of his previous identity and memories. But how he had developed this amnesia, the doctors had no idea. And of course, Fritz had no idea either. It's unlikely we will ever get any more answers about what truly happened to Larry Bader on that stormy day on Lake Erie. Because just 1 year after his old identity was discovered, Fritz Johnson, or Larry Bader, passed away. He had been suffering from cancer in one of his eyes, which was why he wore the eye patch. The cancer returned, and this time it took his life. He died without ever recovering a single memory of his life as Larry Bader. Today, his case is still considered one of the most baffling and believable cases of profound amnesia ever recorded. He was a man who lived 2 completely separate lives, and he died only remembering one of them. Just outside of the popular tourist town of Amaga in northern Colombia, there's a thick green jungle that stretches for miles. If you know where to look, you can find a narrow walking path that winds its way from the edge of the town deep into the wilderness. If you follow that path far enough, it will eventually lead you to a truly incredible sight, an enormous old railroad bridge that spans a huge deep ravine. The bridge is no longer used for trains. It was decommissioned many years ago. But, ironically, since the trains stopped running, the bridge has seen more traffic than ever. It's just a different kind of traffic now. People come from all over to visit this bridge for one specific, heart-pounding reason: to go bungee jumping. Bungee jumping is a thrill-seeking activity where people leap from high places, like this very bridge, with a long, elastic rope tied to their ankles. The length of that rope is carefully calculated so that when it stretches to its absolute limit, the jumper will stop just short of hitting the ground below. It's an adrenaline rush unlike any other. Back in early July of 2021, a 25-year-old Colombian lawyer named Yesenia Gomez was living in the city of Medellin, about an hour north of Amaga. She turned to her boyfriend and told him she was finally ready to do it. She wanted to go bungee jumping. This was a conversation they had had many times before. Yesenia had always been fascinated by the idea of it, but every time they made actual plans to go, her fear would get the better of her and she would back out at the last minute. But this time was different. For whatever reason, in July of 2021, Yesenia felt she had the courage to finally see it through. Her boyfriend, hearing the seriousness in her voice, seized the opportunity. He had never been bungee jumping either and was eager to try it, but he wouldn't go without her. Now that she seemed genuinely committed, he immediately got on the phone and called the Amaga Bungee Jumping Company. He booked a spot for both of them to jump from the famous railroad bridge. On the day of their jump, which was Sunday, July 18th, Yesenia and her boyfriend got in their car and made the hour-long drive south to Amaga. They found the walking trail and began the trek through the jungle out to the bridge. When they finally emerged from the trees and stepped onto the structure, they were stunned. They knew it was a popular spot, but they had not expected to see so many people. A long line of jumpers, nearly 100 of them, was already snaking its way across the bridge, all waiting for their turn to take the leap. Yesenia and her boyfriend found the end of the line and began their wait. Over the next several hours, they had a front row seat to the spectacle. One by one, they watched the people ahead of them get harnessed up, walk to the edge, and plummet into the ravine below, their screams of terror quickly turning into shouts of joy. In her mind, Yesenia had pictured arriving at the bridge, quickly getting it over with, and then celebrating their bravery. But this long, drawn-out wait was having the opposite effect. With every person who jumped, her own anxiety grew. Suddenly, bungee jumping didn't look fun at all. It looked terrifying. She started to second-guess her decision all over again. Her boyfriend could see the panic rising in her eyes. He tried to calm her down, pointing out how safe it was. He told her to look at all the people who had already jumped. They were all perfectly fine, all smiling and laughing. He told her how proud she would be of herself once it was over. But despite his best efforts, Yesenia couldn't shake the fear. Still, she told him she wasn't going to back down. She was determined to go through with it. Several more high-stress hours passed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Yesenia and her boyfriend reached the front of the line. A staff member who had been running the jumps all day long signaled for them to step forward onto the launch platform. They walked to the very edge, looking down into the vast empty space of the ravine. The staff began fitting them with their harnesses and safety gear. The whole time, Yesenia's panic was escalating. Her heart was hammering in her chest. Her vision started to narrow. This didn't feel like an adventure anymore. It just felt like something she had to survive. She just wanted it to be over. As the staff members were making their final checks, one of them looked at her boyfriend, whose gear was fully connected, and gave the signal. He said, "Okay, jump." Yesenia heard the command. In her panicked state, in the blur of fear and adrenaline, she thought he was talking to her. And so, without a moment's hesitation, Yesenia jumped. But she had made a terrible mistake. The staff member had been talking to her boyfriend, not to her. The staff had only finished putting her harness on. They had not yet attached the actual elastic bungee rope to her ankles. When Yesenia leaped from the platform, there was nothing to stop her fall. Her boyfriend watched in horror. He ripped off his own gear and sprinted down the bridge, leaping over the railing and scrambling down the steep, rocky hillside into the ravine. But by the time he reached his girlfriend at the bottom, it was too late. She was already gone. It would later be determined that Yesenia did not die from the impact with the ground. The autopsy revealed that she had actually died from a massive heart attack that she suffered during the fall. This means she must have realized in those few terrifying seconds after she jumped that she had made a mistake. She knew the bungee cord wasn't attached. And the sheer overwhelming fear of what was about to happen is what literally killed her before she ever reached the bottom. In early 1974, in the small town of Ossett in central England, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living a happy life. He had a wife named Christine and 5 children, and he was known throughout their neighborhood as a great father and a wonderful husband with a fantastic sense of humor. Neighbors would often say that when you walked past the Taylor house, you could almost always hear the sound of Michael laughing or telling jokes to his family. Their home was a place filled with joy. But in April of that year, everything changed. Michael was doing some repairs around the house when he fell from a ladder and injured his back. The injury itself wasn't severe, but it left him with chronic, nagging pain. And that constant pain began to change him. The cheerful, funny, happy-go-lucky Michael Taylor slowly disappeared. In his place was a man who was sad, withdrawn, and deeply depressed. He became so irritable that his own family found it difficult to be around him. He would lash out at them over the smallest things. The laughter in the Taylor home was replaced with a tense silence. The Taylors were not a particularly religious family. But in a small town like Osset at that time, most of their friends and neighbors were. When one of Michael's friends learned about how much he was struggling, he approached Michael with a suggestion. He told him that he should really consider turning to religion for help and guidance. Specifically, he recommended a local Christian group called the Christian Fellowship Group. It wasn't a formal church, but rather a small, dedicated prayer group for people who wanted a deeper level of spiritual support. But the real draw of this group, the friend explained, was its leader. Her name was Marie Robinson. She was only 21 years old, but she was incredibly charismatic, energetic, and friendly. She had a special way of making everyone in her group feel welcome and important. Michael's friend was convinced that Marie could be the one to help him, that she could help him find his way back to being his old self. Michael was at rock bottom. He was desperate and felt like he had nothing to lose. So he agreed to give it a try. On the 12th of September, 1974, Michael went to the church where the fellowship group held its meetings. He walked inside and found his way to a back room. When he entered, he saw about 20 people sitting in a circle of chairs. As soon as they noticed him, they all stood up and greeted him with open arms, welcoming him and inviting him to sit with them. Then, the woman who had to be Marie stood up. She had a huge, warm smile on her face. She looked directly at Michael and encouraged him to come and take the empty seat right next to her. For the first time in a very long time, a genuine smile spread across Michael's face. He walked across the room and sat down beside Marie. As she began to lead the group in prayer, Michael noticed something incredible. For that brief period of time, he didn't feel his chronic back pain. He just felt happy again. But when the meeting was over and Michael returned home, the pain and the depression came flooding back. It was as if the only place he could find relief was inside that church with that group. And so, Michael became completely devoted to it. He attended every single meeting. Over the next couple of weeks, he grew very close to Marie, and it seemed that Marie was growing very close to him as well. They started staying behind after the meetings were over, just the two of them, spending time together in what they called quiet prayer. Nobody knew exactly what they were doing, but their bond was obvious. It wasn't long before other members of the group began to suspect that they were having an affair. In a small town like Osset, rumors travel fast. The whispers from inside the church soon spread throughout the town. And before long, Michael's wife, Christine, started hearing them from her friends and neighbors. She was told that her husband was cheating on her with the young leader of his new prayer group. Christine had already had her own suspicion. Marie was the only thing Michael ever talked about anymore. On October 1st, just a few weeks after Michael first joined the group, Christine decided she had to know the truth. She waited until Michael left the house to head to his evening meeting. Then she got in her car and followed him to the church. She parked across the street, took a deep breath to steady her nerves, and then she got out and marched towards the front doors. She stormed inside, found the room where the meeting was being held, and burst through the door. She pointed directly at her husband, who was sitting with his back to her, and she yelled, "I know you're having an affair with Marie." You're going to admit it, right here, in front of this whole group. Michael stood up from his chair. But instead of turning to face his wife, instead of addressing her accusation, he turned and stared across the room at Marie. And when Marie made eye contact with him, she let out a blood-curdling scream. She would later say that in that moment, Michael didn't look human. He looked, in her words, like a beast. His eyes were wild. As Michael stood there, locked in this intense, aggressive stare with Marie, he suddenly began speaking in tongues. It's a phenomenon where a person utters words or sounds that resemble a language, but it's unintelligible to the speaker. The belief is that some other entity is speaking through them. Michael was barking these strange words and sounds at Marie. Everyone else in the room was frozen in shock. It had all happened so fast. Christine's sudden accusation, Michael's bizarre and terrifying reaction, Before anyone could do anything, Michael went from just speaking in tongues to lunging across the room as if he was going to physically attack Marie. Instantly, the other members of the group sprang into action. They jumped on top of Michael, trying to hold him down. But even with 10 or 15 people piling on top of him, he fought with an incredible strength, screaming and snarling, still trying to get to Marie. And then, something even stranger happened. Marie herself suddenly broke out into tongues. And as soon as she did, Michael stopped struggling so violently. He stayed on the floor, pinned down, and just continued to speak in tongues back at her. The two of them were looking at each other, having this strange, otherworldly conversation, while the rest of the group, completely dumbfounded, could only pray. After about an hour of this, Michael suddenly went limp. He collapsed as if he had lost consciousness. The room fell silent. Everyone stared at Michael's still form on the floor. After a moment, his eyes fluttered open. He looked around frantically as if he was waking up in a strange place with no idea how he had gotten there. Michael would claim he had absolutely no memory of the events that had just transpired. At this point, Marie turned to him and Christine. She told them that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force. And the only way to help him, she said, was to perform an exorcism. An exorcism is a religious ritual aimed at expelling a supposedly evil spirit from a person or a place. Michael and Christine were completely at a loss. They were both in a state of shock for very different reasons, and they had no idea what to do. They simply deferred to Marie's judgment. They agreed that an exorcism seemed like the only way forward. So they left the church and went home. The next morning, Marie contacted the Anglican Church of England and formally requested an exorcism for Michael Taylor. After hearing the details of what had happened, the church agreed. They said it did indeed sound like a case that required an exorcism. The following day, they sent two of their most experienced exorcists, a man named Peter and another named Raymond, to Ossett. Peter and Raymond went to the Taylor home and observed Michael. It didn't take them long to reach the same conclusion. They too believed that Michael was possessed by at least one demonic entity. They told Michael that an exorcism was the only solution, but they needed his full consent to proceed. Michael agreed. Christine, still completely overwhelmed and just going along with whatever the experts said, agreed as well. A day later, on the night of October 4th, everyone gathered at another church in a neighboring town. It was 10 p.m. Michael, Christine, the two exorcists, and all the members of the Christian fellowship group were there. Michael was seated in a chair in the middle of the room. As soon as Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying, Michael erupted. He started screaming in tongues and writhing in his chair. He fell to the floor and began contorting his body into grotesque and unnatural positions, as if the words of the prayers were causing him physical agony. The exorcism went on for 8 straight hours. At one point, they had to physically tie Michael down to prevent him from harming himself or anyone else in the room. Finally, after 8 grueling hours, they stopped. Peter and Raymond were exhausted. Michael looked completely drained. As soon as the ritual paused, he collapsed on the ground unconscious. When he eventually came to, he was still tied down, and he looked around wildly, again with no memory of what had just happened. Peter and Raymond told him that the exorcism had been mostly successful. They claimed they had identified 40 different demons inside of him, and that the ritual had managed to expel 37 of them. But, they warned, there were still 3 demons left inside. They were all too tired to continue right now. They told Michael to go home, get some rest, and they would return the next day to finish the job and cast out the final 3 demons. And so, Michael and Christine left the church and headed home. A few hours later, around noon the next day, a woman who lived near the Taylors heard a strange noise outside her house. It sounded like someone yelling. She went to her front window and pulled back the curtain to look outside. What she saw made her gasp. Walking down the middle of the street was Michael Taylor. He was completely naked and covered from head to toe in blood. He was rambling incoherently about Satan. The woman immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they found Michael curled up in the fetal position on the sidewalk outside the woman's house. He was giggling to himself like a small child. The police cautiously approached him. At some point, Michael seemed to snap out of his state and looked up at the officers as if he had no idea what was going on. They eventually got him to tell them his name and where he lived. After calling for backup to handle Michael, the first responding officers made their way to the Taylor residence. They went inside. And the moment they saw the scene, one of the officers turned around, ran back outside, and began to vomit on the lawn. The inside of the Taylor family home would become one of the most infamous and gruesome crime scenes in English history. A few hours earlier, when Michael and Christine had returned from the exorcism, Michael had fallen into another one of his trances. He had brutally attacked his wife, beating her until she fell to the ground. Then, as she was dying, Michael had jumped on top of her and, using only his bare hands, had ripped her face off and thrown it across the room. As she bled to death, he began rubbing her blood all over his own body. After she was dead, he found the family dog and killed it as well. Fortunately, their 5 children had not been home at the time of the horrific attack, and they were unharmed. During Michael's trial, both the prosecution and the defense pointed the finger at the Anglican Church and at Marie Robinson's religious group. They argued that by performing the exorcism, they had effectively convinced Michael that he was possessed by demons, which in turn caused him to have a psychotic break and act out with such extreme violence. Ultimately, Michael Taylor was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He spent only 4 years in psychiatric care before he was released. Today, he is reportedly still living as a free man in Ossett. But despite the legal outcome, there are many people, both religious and non-religious, who believe the case of Michael Taylor is one of the few genuine and terrifying cases of demonic possession in modern history. And as for whether Michael and Marie were actually having an affair, it was never definitively proven, but it has always been widely assumed that they were. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the afternoon of the 10th of April, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Auget stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern. It was a small local spot in Hudson, Florida. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, or at least they think they do. Diane held a glass in her hand. She brought it to her lips and downed the last few sips of her drink. Her vision was starting to get blurry, and a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. But she didn't care. In fact, that was kind of the point. She yelled out to the bartender, her voice slurred and thick, telling him to bring her another round. She wanted to get so drunk that she could forget everything. Because right then, her life felt like a complete disaster. It hadn't always been this way. Not too long ago, Diane had been a married stay-at-home mother. She had 3 kids, and they were her entire world. She loved them more than anything. But about 10 years before this night at the bar, her life had taken a very difficult turn. She started having very serious mental health problems. After a long and difficult process, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was a heavy diagnosis, one that came with a whole new set of challenges. She would fall into these deep, dark depressions. They were so powerful, they would make it almost impossible for her to function, to even get out of bed in the morning. Then, like a switch would flip, she would swing into these intense manic episodes. These would keep her awake for days on end, leaving her so delirious and exhausted that she would start talking to herself, seeing things that weren't there. Living with this was incredibly hard, not just for Diane, but for her family. Eventually, the strain became too much. Her husband divorced her, and in the custody battle that followed, he was awarded full custody of their children. Losing her kids, even if she understood why, was a blow that Diane never fully recovered from. By 1998, her life had sort of leveled off into a new, difficult normal. She was living with her sister, which provided some support and a roof over her head. But her bipolar disorder was far from under control. She had medication for it, but she wasn't always consistent about taking it. So, the cycles continued. The crushing lows of depression, followed by the chaotic highs of mania. She had been in and out of various psychiatric facilities more times than her family could count. Each time, they hoped it would be the one that finally helped her find stability. But it never seemed to stick. So, on this particular night, April 10th, Diane was in a dark place. She just wanted to numb the pain, to drown her sorrows, and make the world go quiet for a little while. A couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house. She didn't say where she was going. She didn't own a car, so she just started walking. Her feet eventually carried her to the Hayloft Tavern. And for the past couple of hours, she had been standing there, mostly by herself, pacing in circles and drinking alone. Just then, the bartender came back over to her side of the bar. Diane was seeing double, but she could clearly see that he wasn't carrying another drink for her. His hands were empty. He had a look on his face that was half annoyed, half sympathetic. He told her he was cutting her off, that she'd had enough. Diane was furious. The feeling of humiliation washed over her. She started to argue with him, telling him he didn't know what he was talking about, that she was fine, but the bartender just held up his hands and stood his ground. He was sorry, he said, but she was cut off. There was a finality in his voice. Defeated and angry, Diane turned and stumbled out of the bar, disappearing into the Florida night. The next day, April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, was pacing back and forth inside her living room. She held a phone pressed tightly to her ear, listening to it ring. After a couple of rings, a dispatcher from the local police department answered. In a shaky voice, Mildred told them she needed to report her daughter, Diane, as a missing person. A little while earlier, Mildred had gotten a call from her other daughter, the one Diane was living with. She said that Diane had left the house the night before and still hadn't come home. She hadn't called, hadn't left a note, nothing. Given Diane's history of mental illness and her often erratic behavior, Mildred's mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. She felt a deep, cold pit of fear in her stomach. Her daughter had to be in some kind of trouble. On the phone with the police dispatcher, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that Diane had just left on her own for some reason. But it was just as possible, if not more so, that she was having a manic episode. When that happened, Diane could become disoriented. She might have wandered off and gotten lost, with no idea how to get back home. The dispatcher was calm and professional. She assured Mildred that she would send officers to interview her and her other daughter right away. They would start looking for Diane immediately. But 4 days went by. 4 long, agonizing days. And on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Mildred went down to the police station. It was a trip she had made every single day since her daughter had disappeared, hoping for any scrap of news. But just like all the other days, the police didn't have any new information for her. They told her what little they knew, which wasn't much. They had confirmed that on the night of April 10th, after leaving her sister's house, Diane had gone to the Hayloft Tavern. They spoke to the bartender, who confirmed he had cut her off because she was incredibly drunk. He said she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last he saw of her. Investigators had also found a couple of people who had seen Diane the following day, on April 11th. She had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from the tavern. Another witness spotted her near a locally owned motel right off the highway, a place called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the trail went cold. The police told Mildred they had no idea what happened to Diane after that. They didn't know where she could have gone or what could have happened to her. Mildred left the police station feeling a profound sense of disappointment and fear. The drive home was a blur. Her mind was racing, playing out all the terrible possibilities. Was her daughter hiding somewhere on purpose? Had she gotten lost and was now hurt, hungry, and alone? Or had she run into the wrong person? Had she been kidnapped? Or worse? These scenarios tormented her, each one more terrifying than the last. Finally, she pulled into her driveway and went inside. She sat down on her couch, exhausted, and tried to think about what she could possibly do next. And that's when she noticed it. The little red light on her answering machine was blinking. She had a new voicemail. Mildred thought maybe it was her other daughter, calling with an update while she was out. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something to do with Diane. She got up, walked over to the machine, and pressed the play button. What she heard next made her blood run cold. It was Diane's voice, and she sounded absolutely terrified. Through the static of the machine, Mildred could hear her daughter crying out, "Help! Let me out!" Then there was a scuffling sound on the recording, like someone had grabbed the phone away from Diane. Mildred heard Diane say something like, "Hey, give me that," and then the call just cut off. The line went dead. After hearing the message, Mildred went into a total panic. Her worst fears were no longer just possibilities in her head. They felt real. It sounded like her daughter was in terrible immediate danger. Shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked at the small display for the caller ID, desperate to see who had left this horrifying message. But all it said was that the call had come in from a place called Starlight. The name meant nothing to Mildred. She quickly dialed the number back, her heart pounding in her chest, praying that someone would pick up. But no one answered. The phone just rang and rang. With trembling hands, Mildred called the police. This voicemail changed everything. It was now obvious to the police that Diane hadn't just left on purpose, and she wasn't just lost. Based on that recording, it sounded like she had been kidnapped and was being held somewhere against her will. But the question was, where? The police had no idea. They tried to trace the call, but they couldn't pinpoint a specific location. And they couldn't figure out what Starlight was either. Was it a business? A nickname for a location? They had no leads. So, for another full day, despite this terrifying new clue, the investigation stalled. There just wasn't much to go on. That is, until the next afternoon. On April 16th, 5 days after Diane had disappeared, the police got a call. It was from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19. He told the dispatcher he had found something disturbing lying in the grass. He said he wasn't even sure if the object was real, but it looked so troubling that he thought the police should come and check it out, just in case. Police immediately rushed out to the location. They met the man, who showed them what he had found. The officers carefully collected the object and sent it off to the crime lab for testing. Then they waited. When the analysis came back, they learned two things. First, the object was definitely real. And second, it belonged to Diane Augat. It was the severed tip of her finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, the case of Diane Augat grew colder but stranger. People would occasionally call in sightings of her to the police in Florida. Investigators looked into every single tip. They interviewed more than 100 people, chasing down every possible lead. But nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, the mysterious place where that desperate voicemail had originated. And they never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off and left by the side of the highway. But despite the lack of answers, strange clues that were definitely tied to Diane kept turning up in the most bizarre places. For example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a plastic bag inside their store's outdoor freezer. Inside the bag were Diane's clothes, all neatly folded. Who would put them there, and why? Another time, a customer at a different nearby convenience store found another plastic bag that had been left behind on a countertop. This bag was full of toiletries, including eyeliner, perfume, and lipstick. And on the outside of the bag, scrawled in marker, was the name Diane. Police were never able to figure out who placed either of the bags or what they were supposed to mean. Unfortunately, today, more than 2 decades later, Diane's case remains unsolved. Her family has never stopped looking for answers. Around 3:30 inches the afternoon on the 17th of December, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside a U.S. Navy submarine. The vessel was cruising silently underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the very front of the submarine, stationed inside a small, windowless compartment known as the torpedo room. It was about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. On one side, a heavy metal door stood open, leading out to the rest of the sub. The walls of the room were lined with 6 bunks for the crew, a tangled mess of machinery, and several long, menacing torpedoes. Despite the cramped and dark conditions, Joe was absolutely thrilled to be there. Working on a submarine had been his dream for as long as he could remember. When he was just a little kid, he had actually built his own periscope out of a piece of wood. A periscope on a real submarine is like a long set of binoculars that can be raised up from the sub. It allows the crew to be just below the surface of the water, hidden from view, while the periscope pokes just barely out of the water to see what's going on around them. With this fake wooden periscope, Joe and his older sister, Florence, would spend hours and hours pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater, going on all sorts of secret and important missions. So, years later, when Joe turned 18, remember, the very first thing he did was enlist in the Navy. And just recently, he had finally been assigned to work on this exact submarine. For Joe, it was literally his childhood dream coming true. On this particular day, Joe was taking part in one of his very first test sails. The mission was simple. He and the other 40 men on board were just running through drills, testing all the different machinery to make sure everything was in perfect working order. Joe and 5 other men had been assigned to the torpedo room. They were standing by, waiting for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom system overhead. But as they were standing there, waiting in the quiet hum of the submarine, something happened. Out of nowhere, Joe heard a loud, grating, metallic sound. It echoed through the entire submarine, a horrible screech of metal against metal. The sub itself shook so violently from the impact that Joe and the other men were thrown off their feet, falling hard to the metal floor. Immediately, Joe and his coworkers scrambled to get up. They looked at each other with wide, confused eyes, all thinking the same thing. What was that? But before they could even say a word, their worst nightmare began to unfold. A torrent of seawater began to rush through that open door, flooding in from the rest of the submarine and into the torpedo room. As this absolutely horrifying scenario was playing out, Joe's immediate reaction was a strange and overwhelming sense of déjà vu. For just a split second, he felt like he had experienced this exact moment before. But before he could even process that bizarre feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him. They managed to get to the door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine, and with all their strength, they slammed it shut and sealed it tight. At that point, Joe was snapped back to reality. He wasn't thinking about the feeling of déjà vu anymore. He was focused on what was happening. He realized there must have been some kind of terrible accident. Everyone in the room thought the same thing. That horrible grating sound, the shaking, the rushing water, it could only mean one thing. Something had struck their submarine. He expected to hear the captain's voice come over the intercom at any second, not to continue the test run, but with urgent orders about what they should do now that a real-world emergency was happening. And so, for a couple of minutes, Joe and his 5 fellow sailors just sat there in the now sealed-off torpedo room, waiting in silence for that announcement. But there was nothing. Just the sound of their own breathing and the faint creaks of the submarine. And then they all felt a final, heavy jolt, as if the entire submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. They knew that whatever had happened was not good. It was serious. But they figured it wasn't a total catastrophe just yet. It was bad, but maybe they could be saved. After all, they were only about a mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room had no way to communicate with the outside world from where they were, they assumed that someone in the other parts of the submarine would be able to send out a distress call to the Coast Guard. They figured help was already on its way. But the minutes slowly turned into hours. And there was no progress. There was no sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They heard nothing over the intercom. They couldn't even hear any sounds from the other side of the sealed door. They thought that by now, surely one of their comrades would have come over and knocked or tried to talk to them in some way. But there was only silence. To make matters worse, the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered and died, plunging them into total darkness. They were trapped at the bottom of the bay in a sealed metal room with no light. They also had no food and no water. All the supplies were in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't risk opening the door. More water could come rushing in. They were completely and utterly trapped. All of that was horrible, but the scariest part of the whole situation was something they all knew but didn't want to say out loud. There was a finite amount of oxygen inside that sealed room. And with every single breath they took, they were using up that precious air supply. Pretty soon, that tiny metal torpedo room started to feel less like a part of a submarine and more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He lost all track of time in the endless dark. And with each passing hour, he was starting to lose hope. But then, suddenly, Joe heard a sound. It was a loud, metallic, clanging sound. He realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine. Their rescue had begun. Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunks, knocking into each other in the pitch-black room. They scrambled over to the hull of the sub and began knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that they were alive. They were still in there. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication that uses a series of taps, Joe was able to have a conversation with the people outside. He confirmed that they were Coast Guard rescue divers. And they told Joe what had happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had accidentally struck their submarine. The collision had punctured the hull, and the submarine had sunk to the bottom. Everyone else on board, besides Joe and the 5 men with him in the torpedo room, had drowned. When Joe and the others heard this news, it was horrifying. But at the same time, they were hit with a wave of relief. Had they not sealed that door as fast as they did, they would be dead too. They were so incredibly lucky to be alive. So, after hearing this message, Joe began frantically knocking back a new message. He basically said, well, that's great, but when are you going to get us out of here? He explained that they were running out of air, that it was getting harder and harder to breathe. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best. They would get them up as soon as they possibly could. And this was true. The Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could to save them. But the reality was, this was a really, really difficult problem. You have 6 people trapped inside a small air pocket deep underwater. If you try to open any part of the submarine, the immense pressure of the ocean would cause water to rush in so quickly that it would kill everyone inside instantly. So that wasn't an option. You also had the ticking clock. As Joe had said, they were running out of air. This meant there was a very compressed timeline to figure this out. So really, the only option was to somehow lift the entire submarine with everyone still inside and raise it to the surface. But this was 1927. This would be a complicated thing to do even with modern technology, let alone nearly 100 years ago. But it was their best and only chance. The plan was to bring in multiple ships with different kinds of heavy-duty lifts and somehow scoop up the submarine and bring it to the surface before everyone inside suffocated. But there was another problem. Just as they began to organize all these ships, a huge storm rolled in. The surface of the ocean was now being battered by extremely high winds, making it nearly impossible to position the ships and their lifting equipment. And unfortunately, the weather forecast said this storm was going to rage for days. While this catastrophe was playing out off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper. She read yet another article about the sunken submarine where she knew her little brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspapers, desperate for any piece of good news. But every article, every news segment, said the same thing. The 6 men trapped inside the sub were still alive. They were communicating with the divers. But the storm on the surface was still too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and it wasn't just because the situation itself was so dangerous. It was because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. More specifically, she remembered the very last time they ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old. The two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then, Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope. He turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to explain what he meant, but he had refused. In fact, after that day, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about that strange moment in years. But now, seeing what was happening to her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received the official word. Her brother Joe and all the other sailors trapped in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. Florence was completely grief-stricken. This was her baby brother, and he had just died in this horrible, drawn-out way. But also, strangely, for the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years ago when he was just 4 years old when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." It's an expression used in the Navy to mean that everybody on board a ship has died. He was saying their make-believe submarine had just sunk, and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence had tried to get 4-year-old Joe to explain, but he wouldn't. And he never played the game again. So now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother, all those years ago, had somehow predicted his own death. On the evening of the 19th of April, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was relaxing, watching some television, when his phone rang. Thomas picked it up and said hello. He heard the voice of his daughter Patricia on the other end of the line. And right away he could tell from the tone of her voice that she was feeling really down. This didn't really surprise him. Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she had been struggling a lot lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from him in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. She liked her job, for the most part, mainly because she absolutely loved animals. But she had a really hard time getting along with people. She was lonely. She didn't have a lot of close friends. On top of that, she had recently been through a tough breakup. And even though she had always wanted kids, she had never had any of her own. To her father, it seemed like his daughter was going through a classic midlife crisis. So, as Thomas was on the phone, listening to his daughter make small talk about her life, he decided to cut through it. He just asked her, "Hey, what's going on? How are you really doing?" Patricia paused for a moment. Then, she vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress. She told him she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. She then asked her dad if he would be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh, maybe moving back in with him for a while. Thomas adored his daughter, and he felt for everything she was going through. So, without a moment's hesitation, he told her, of course. Of course she could come home anytime she wanted. Hearing this definitely seemed to lighten Patricia's mood. She told her dad that she would call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him, and she hung up the phone. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter ever again. The following day, April 20th, at about 8:15 inches the evening, something strange happened 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh. A woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated two-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside. The only thing Carol could see was the red taillights of the one car driving in front of her. Beyond that, on either side of the highway, there was just big, empty fields stretching out into the darkness. But then, out of nowhere, the car in front of her, which had been driving along at a steady speed, suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just confused. Why would they do that? What caused that car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then, a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her, in her lane, was another car driving the wrong way, barreling straight towards her. Carol jammed on her brakes and tried to swerve out of the way, just like the car in front of her had done. But she wasn't fast enough. The other car smashed into her, basically head-on. Carol felt her head snap back against the seat. There was a deafening, metallic crunching sound, and then everything went black. Just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes. She realized she had survived the crash. She felt a sharp pain in her neck, and her car was a complete mess. The airbags had deployed. It was obvious she'd been in a very serious wreck, but she was alive. Eventually, Carol managed to push her door open and climb out of the car. Her first thought was to check on the other driver. The other car was smashed right up against hers, and she couldn't see if the person inside was okay. So she got out and started walking over to the other vehicle. But before she could reach it, the driver of the other car also climbed out. In the combined glare of both cars' headlights, Carol could see that the other person was a middle-aged woman. She appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, she didn't seem to be hurt, at least not visibly. In fact, what was really weird was that she seemed very, very calm. This woman just stood there by her wrecked car, not saying a single word to Carol. She didn't acknowledge what she had just done, which was drive the wrong way down a highway and smash head-on into Carol's car, nearly killing her. There was no recognition of that at all. Instead, she just stood there. And then, eventually, she turned and just stared directly at Carol. This was starting to get very alarming for Carol. It caused her to stop in her tracks and just stand there as well, staring back at this woman, not really sure what to do or say. And as Carol was waiting to see what would happen next, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, simply turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled out to her to stop. She shouted that she couldn't go, that they had just been in a horrible accident, and they had to wait for the police to get there. She couldn't just leave the scene. But the woman didn't even look back. She just calmly walked off the highway, climbed over a wire fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road, and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She had just vanished into the darkness. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the two wrecked cars and a very shaken Carol. The other driver, as Carol explained, was gone. So the police ran the license plate of the car that had hit Carol's. They learned that it was registered to a 37-year-old woman named Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that Patricia had apparently just walked away from the crash, the other weird thing was that the registration showed she lived 400 miles away. The police had no idea what she was even doing all the way out here in Circle, Montana. Patricia did not come back to the crash site. So eventually, the police called in K-9 units, and they began searching for her. The dogs were able to pick up her trail. They found a line of her footprints leading out into that dark field. They followed that trail for hours and hours, deep into the empty landscape. But eventually, the footprints just stopped, and the dogs lost her scent. The police would continue looking for her, but they never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she had just wandered into that field and vanished into thin air. But that was not the end of the story. About 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Luverne, Minnesota. This was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, he had actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance. He'd seen pictures of her, because by this point, her case had become national news. So, when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth all by herself, silently drinking a glass of water and just staring off into space, he immediately thought it was Patricia. The police officer had no idea if this really was her. He was pretty confident it was, but it just seemed so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if she was alone or what she was doing. So, instead of getting up and talking to her, he decided to just stay in his seat and keep an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, the woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth. She slowly drank water and stared off into space for 5 straight hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed for the night. An employee had to go over and tell the woman that she had to leave. They also told the officer that he too had to go. So, after the officer and the woman he thought was Patricia had left the restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued to watch her. And she just walked right across the street and went into a diner that was open all night. This time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, walked right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her. He just said, "What's your name?" For a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused, like she couldn't understand why a random police officer was sitting with her. But instead of challenging him, she just went quiet for a second. And then, in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no. I'm from Israel." And before she could give up any more information, like her name or why she was there, she suddenly jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. The police officer was caught off guard. He was a little slow to get up and chase after her. He ran outside too, but by the time he got out there, she had disappeared again. Over the next month or so, the police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports just like this one. They came from people who believed they had seen Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings. They believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia, that it wasn't just some look-alike. And in every single case, the witnesses reported the same thing. This woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just try to help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all across the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan. But still, we do not know where she is. Her case, to this day, is still open and unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Sometimes we think we have a solid grip on how the world works. We wake up, we go about our normal routines, and we assume that the rules of reality will keep everything in its proper place. We trust our senses, we trust our minds, and we trust that the environments we step into will behave in predictable ways. But every now and then, the universe decides to throw those rules completely out the window. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that demonstrate just how bizarre, unpredictable, and downright terrifying life can be when the ordinary suddenly collides with the impossible. These are stories about real people who found themselves in situations that sound like they were pulled straight from a Hollywood movie. But every single one of these events actually happened, and the details will leave you questioning how much we truly know about the world around us. From a chaotic clash of identities on the streets of Detroit, to a mysterious voice that acted as a guardian angel in London, and finally to a man who defied the laws of probability in the dark waters of the Atlantic, these stories show us that reality is often much stranger than fiction. Our first story takes us to the city of Detroit, Michigan, specifically to the east side of the city on Andover Street. If you were to ask anyone who lives in this neighborhood, they would tell you right away that Andover Street has a reputation. It is an area that has been heavily affected by drug activity for a very long time. Because of this, the local police department is constantly running operations to try and clean up the streets and keep the community safe. On a cold Thursday morning, specifically November 9th, 2017, two special operations officers from the Detroit Police Department were getting ready to start a specific type of undercover operation known as a push-off. Now, if you are not familiar with what a push-off is, it is basically a reverse sting operation. Undercover police officers will set themselves up in an area, usually in a house that is known for drug transactions, and they will pretend to be the local drug dealers. When unsuspecting customers walk up to the house trying to buy drugs, the undercover officers will invite them inside, wait for them to make a verbal request to purchase illegal substances, and then immediately arrest them and seize their vehicles. These two particular special operations officers had been working deep undercover in this specific neighborhood for quite a while. Because they had been there so long, they had a very specific local drug house that they had secured and set up for this exact operation. They arrived at the house, got themselves in character, and began to wait. Meanwhile, not too far away, another unit from a completely different police precinct was planning their own drug enforcement operation for that very same day. This second unit consisted of a group of undercover officers who were running a buy-bust operation. A buy-bust is the exact opposite of a push-off. In a buy-bust, undercover officers pretend to be drug buyers. They walk around the neighborhood, look for active drug houses, and attempt to buy illegal substances from real drug dealers. Once the transaction is initiated, they signal their backup team to swoop in and make the arrest. But the problem was that there was a massive breakdown in communication between the two different police precincts. Neither group had any idea that the other group was operating on Andover Street that morning. It was a classic bureaucratic oversight, but on the streets, it was a recipe for disaster. Around midday, two undercover officers from the 2nd Precinct were walking down Andover Street looking for active drug houses. They saw the house where the first two undercover officers were waiting. To the officers from the 2nd Precinct, this house looked exactly like a real active drug house, and to the officers inside, the two men walking up to the porch looked exactly like typical drug customers. The two undercover buyers walked up the steps and knocked on the front door. The undercover officers inside opened the door, looked them over, and in accordance with their training, invited them inside. The buyers walked in and sat down in the living room. The undercover officers, acting as dealers, asked them what they were looking for. The buyers then asked if they could purchase some drugs. As soon as those words left their mouths, the undercover officers, acting as dealers, whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and ordered the two men to get on the ground. But instead of complying, the two buyers did something that absolutely shocked the dealers. They also whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and yelled back that no, they were the ones who needed to get on the ground. At this point, both groups of officers were standing in a freezing, high-tension standoff. Neither side believed the other side was actually telling the truth. In the high-stakes world of undercover operations, criminals will often pose as police officers to rob rival dealers or escape arrest. So, the officers from the 1st Precinct were convinced that these two buyers were actually armed criminals using fake police badges. And the officers from the 2nd Precinct were convinced that the dealers were criminals trying to rip them off with fake badges of their own. They stood there, guns pointed at each other, in a tense standoff that looked exactly like that famous scene from The Office, where everyone is pointing a gun at everyone else, trying to figure out who the double agent is. They began periodically hurling insults and threats at each other, trying to force the other side to stand down. But nobody was backing down. The tension in the room was boiling over, and both sides were terrified that if they fired a shot, it would end in a bloodbath. But instead of pulling their triggers, when neither side stood down, they all eventually lowered their weapons. But they did not talk it out. Instead, they lunged at each other and proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. A massive, chaotic fistfight broke out right there in the living room. Within moments, the backup officers from both precincts, who had been waiting nearby in unmarked vehicles, saw the commotion and rushed into the house. But instead of breaking up the fight, they also got confused and joined in. It turned into a massive brawl of police officers fighting other police officers, with punches flying, furniture breaking, and complete chaos taking over the house. After the dust finally settled and the haymakers had stopped, someone finally managed to get a radio transmission through, and the two groups of police suddenly realized the monumental mistake they had just made. They immediately stopped fighting and began to apologize to one another, nursing their bruises and panting for air. Luckily, none of the officers were critically injured in this bizarre mix-up. However, two officers did have to be taken to the hospital for treatment, though fortunately their injuries were very minor. One officer ended up with a massive black eye, and another had a split lip. When the news of this incident got out, Detroit's own chief of police, along with the media and the public at large, all came out and said that this entire snafu was a total embarrassment for the department. It showed a clear lack of coordination and communication. But, on the other hand, some people argued that the officers involved actually deserved a little bit of credit. After all, their job was to be undercover. And they were apparently so incredibly good at being undercover that they were able to completely fool other trained professional police officers who were looking for the exact same things. It turns out they were just too good at their jobs, but you can be the judge of that. Our next story was pulled from a 1997 article published in the prestigious British medical journal, The Show. This article was written by a psychiatrist who personally treated the patient, who will be the focal point of this story. The only reason we bring this up right at the beginning is because this story sounds so completely made up that if it were not documented in an official, peer-reviewed medical journal, it would be almost impossible to believe. One night in the cold winter of 1984, a healthy, middle-aged woman, who we will call Brenda for the sake of this story, was sitting in her quiet home in London, England. It was a completely normal, peaceful evening. Brenda was sitting on her couch, enjoying the quiet warmth of her living room and reading a book. But as she was reading, she suddenly heard a voice speak directly in her head. The voice did not sound like her own thoughts, and it did not sound like it was coming from the room around her. It was a distinct, clear, calm voice that spoke directly into her mind. The voice said, "Please do not be afraid." I know this must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this was the easiest way I could think of. My friend and I, we used to work at the Children's Hospital, and we would like to help you. Brenda sat frozen on her couch. She could not believe what was happening. She had absolutely no history of mental illness, she had never heard voices in her head before, and she was a completely rational, healthy person. The voice she was hearing was so incredibly clear, and it did not sound like any voice she had ever heard in her real life. At first, Brenda did not do anything. She just sat there on the couch holding her book, waiting and hoping that this was just some strange, fleeting trick of her mind. But the voice in her head seemed to pick up on her internal panic. The voice spoke again and said, "Brenda, this is not a hallucination. We are real, and we want to help you." Brenda did not believe the voice was real. She was absolutely convinced that she had just lost her mind and was experiencing some kind of sudden, severe mental breakdown. For the rest of the night, she did her absolute best to completely ignore the voice in her head, trying to focus on anything else. First thing the next morning, Brenda went to her doctor's office, explained what was happening, and begged them for help. The doctor was very concerned and immediately referred her to a local psychiatrist. Brenda went over to the psychiatrist's office and they performed a thorough psychological evaluation. After talking with her, the psychiatrist admitted that they did not really know why she was suddenly hearing these voices. There was absolutely no clear medical explanation or typical trigger for why a healthy, middle-aged woman with no history of mental issues would suddenly start hearing clear, distinct voices. So Brenda was ultimately diagnosed with a rare condition called functional hallucinatory psychosis. This diagnosis basically meant that Brenda was indeed hallucinating, but there was no clear physical or psychological reason why it was happening. The psychiatrist began treating Brenda with a strong antipsychotic drug, and they also set up regular supportive counseling sessions. Over the next couple of weeks, Brenda was incredibly diligent. She took her medications exactly as prescribed, and she never missed a single appointment. And slowly but surely, the voices in her mind began to fade, and eventually they stopped completely. Brenda was overjoyed. She went back into her psychiatrist's office, looked at him, and said, "Doctor, you have saved me. The voices are completely gone, and I am so happy." The psychiatrist would later write in his medical journal that Brenda was visibly relieved during this appointment. It was completely obvious to him that she was not making any of this up. She had really believed she was hearing these voices, she had been terrified by them, and now she was profoundly grateful to have her life back to normal. After leaving the office, Brenda decided that she and her family needed to celebrate. They decided to go on a vacation outside of London just to relax and enjoy the fact that she had not, in fact, lost her mind. But while they were away on holiday, enjoying the peaceful countryside, the nightmare returned. Brenda suddenly heard the voices in her head again. But this time, the tone was different. It was urgent. The voices told her that she had to get back to London as soon as possible because there was something terribly wrong with her. Along with this warning, the voices did something even more bizarre. They gave her a very specific street address in London that she was supposed to go to in order to seek immediate treatment. Brenda was absolutely horrified. She was devastated that the voices were back after she thought she was cured, but she was also incredibly scared by the specific nature of what they were saying. She began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some terrifying truth to what these voices were telling her. What if there really was something horribly wrong with her body? Brenda ran to her husband crying and explained everything that had just happened. Her husband was a very loving and reassuring man. He held her and told her that she should just try to totally ignore the voices again. He pointed out that they had gone away before with medication, and there was probably nothing physically wrong with her. He urged her to just try to relax and enjoy the rest of their vacation. But Brenda could not relax. No matter what her husband said, she could not ignore the voices because they were constantly speaking to her now, repeating the same urgent message over and over again. They kept saying, "You need to leave, you need to go back, there is something wrong with you." Finally, unable to bear the constant mental pressure, Brenda convinced her family to end their vacation early, pack up their things, and head back to London. As soon as they arrived in the city, Brenda made her husband get in the car with her, and they drove straight to the exact street address the voices had given her. When they arrived and stepped out of the car, they found themselves standing right in front of the brain scan unit of a London hospital. Brenda and her husband stood on the pavement, completely shocked. They had never been to this building before, and Brenda had no prior knowledge of this specific medical facility or its address. But before they could even begin to process the sheer impossibility of what they were looking at, the voices in Brenda's head came back with absolute clarity. They told her that she needed to go inside the building immediately and request a brain scan for two very specific reasons. First, they said there was a tumor in her brain. Second, they said this tumor was causing her brain stem to swell. At first, Brenda went inside the brain scan facility and requested an immediate scan, honestly admitting to the reception staff that voices in her head had directed her to this exact address. Because she had no official doctor referral, the hospital had to turn her away, leaving Brenda in a state of absolute panic. She immediately called her psychiatrist, explaining how the voices had guided her to this real medical building. The psychiatrist was highly skeptical, but agreed to order the scan anyway, solely to put her mind at ease. A month later, Brenda had the scan done, and the results completely shocked the entire medical community. The scan revealed she indeed had a brain tumor, and her brain stem was swollen, despite her showing absolutely no physical symptoms. After consulting her family, Brenda chose immediate surgery. As soon as she made the decision, the voices told her she had made the right choice. The surgery was a total success. In the recovery room, the voices spoke to her one last time, saying they were pleased to have helped her and said goodbye. Brenda never heard them again. To this day, the medical community still has no explanation for who or what those voices in Brenda's head really were. Our final story is about a man named Michael Packard, who might be either the luckiest or unluckiest person alive, depending on how you look at his incredible life. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he survived a horrific plane crash over the jungles of Costa Rica that tragically killed the pilot, co-pilot, and another passenger on impact. Michael and 4 other survivors were left badly injured and stranded in the extremely remote wilderness for 48 agonizing hours before search and rescue teams finally reached them. Doctors later told him he would not have survived another night in the jungle. Over the next 2 decades, Michael, a commercial diver by trade, survived 2 separate great white shark encounters off California, got lost at sea for hours in the open ocean before being miraculously rescued, and even discovered a long-time missing person's body 60 feet underwater off the coast of Massachusetts. But absolutely none of these events compare to what happened to him on the morning of June 11th, 2021, when he experienced a 1 in a trillion event that baffled scientists around the world. On that peaceful summer morning, the 57-year-old Michael climbed into his boat with his longtime diving partner Josiah, heading out off the coast of Cape Cod to do some lobster diving. Around 8 in the morning, after successfully gathering about 100 pounds of lobsters, Michael decided to go down for one final dive. Josiah watched from the boat as Michael disappeared below the surface of the calm water. Suddenly, Josiah saw a massive, violent eruption of white water where Michael had just submerged, followed by a dark shadow moving rapidly below. Michael had been descending to 60 feet when, at about 45 feet, something hit him from behind like a freight train, immediately plunging him into total darkness and knocking his mouthpiece out. Fumbling around in panic, Michael felt soft, warm, quivering, muscular walls that were actively pulsating. He managed to find his regulator, took a deep breath, and realized there were no sharp teeth, meaning he was not inside a shark. He had actually been scooped up by a giant humpback whale. Humpback whales only eat very small fish, and when this whale realized it had accidentally swallowed a human and a heavy metal scuba tank, it began violently shaking its head side to side to eject him. This thrashing was what caused the dramatic eruption of water Josiah saw from the boat. After 45 agonizing seconds inside the whale's mouth, Michael was finally spat back out into the open water. He swam directly to the surface, saw the whale's tail fins swimming away, and was pulled to safety by Josiah. Miraculously, Michael suffered only minor bruising on his legs and was released from the hospital that very same afternoon. He remained incredibly casual about the encounter, telling reporters he could not wait to heal up and get back to lobster diving. These 3 stories, as different as they are, remind us of a powerful truth. We live our lives under the illusion of control, believing our minds, our identities, and our natural world are completely predictable. But whether it is undercover police officers clashing on a Detroit street, a mysterious voice pointing to a silent brain tumor in London, or a commercial diver being swallowed by a gentle giant of the deep off Cape Cod, we are always just one moment away from the completely unbelievable. These events show us that the division between reality and fiction is incredibly thin, and sometimes the strangest mysteries are the ones that actually happen. They leave us with a lingering sense of wonder and a reminder that no matter how much we plan, the universe will always find a way to surprise us. So perhaps the real question is not whether these stories are true or not, but how many similar stories exist that we will never hear about. Because the truth is, moments like these come without warning. They don't follow the rules. And when they happen, they change everything. If you've made it this far, you already know reality is unfair. See you in the next story. The story that we are going to tell today is about a Hollywood actor whose life took a dark and violent turn, and it ended in a way that practically no one could have expected. A great number of individuals have not been exposed to this tale, but once it has been told to you, it is one that you will never be able to forget. Beginning with a young boy who had a dream of being on TV, everything begins with him. Johnny Lewis was only 7 years old when he was cast in his very first acting role throughout his childhood. In all honesty, it wasn't a major motion picture or a well-known television show. Rather, it was a little part in a video about escalator safety. To a child, however, it was a beginning, and it was the beginning of a career that would last a lifetime. Johnny began his career making appearances in dozens of commercials for major businesses, such as Pizza Hut, after he was cast in that little role. In a short amount of time, many working in the sector were able to recognize that this young man possessed actual talent. He was not merely another attractive face, he had the ability to seriously act. Soon after, he began making guest appearances on some of the most popular television shows running during the latter part of the 1990s and the early 2000s. These shows included Seventh Heaven, Malcolm in the Middle, and Drake and Josh. Johnny had reached the age of 18 by the year 2001. Having been employed in a consistent manner for a number of years, he had finally amassed sufficient funds to leave his parents' residence in the North Los Angeles neighborhood. When he moved in with a number of other young actors and actresses who were all striving to make their mark in the entertainment industry, he discovered a place that was located right in the middle of Hollywood. It was a thrilling period that was brimming with opportunities. The trajectory of Johnny's career continued to advance. Fast forward to the year 2006. Now that he is 23 years old, Johnny is simply soaring to new heights. He had secured more big jobs on television, including a recurring role on the immensely popular show The O.C. His face was becoming more and more known to millions of people. His personal life was also making headlines, in addition to the success he had achieved in his professional life. The megapop singer Katy Perry was his girlfriend at the time. The intensity of their relationship was stated to be extremely high, despite the fact that it did not persist for a very long time. It was so intense, in fact, that Katy would go on to write 2 songs that were inspired by their time together, according to reports. However, Johnny's true breakthrough into the public eye, the role that would come to define his career, did not come until 2008, 2 years later. Sons of Anarchy is a brand new biker drama, and he was chosen to play the role of Kip Halfsack Epps in the show. Both in terms of critical acclaim and financial success, the show was a giant. Not only did it make Johnny famous, but it also made him extraordinarily wealthy. He was a darling among the audience, and it appeared as though his future was sealed. And he had succeeded. However, there could be an issue. Johnny was finding himself increasingly anxious about the path that the show was headed, despite the fact that the entire globe adored the show. He had the impression that it was growing unusually violent. Let's face it, Johnny was not the fierce biker character that he portrayed on television. When he was in his real life, he was a quiet and thoughtful individual. When he was not studying philosophy, he enjoyed reading poetry. He did not appreciate going out to parties, but rather drank tea and played chess. He preferred staying up late. In his opinion, the concept of acting out scenes of violence that he considered to be unnecessary was not something that he felt comfortable with. He was not the same person as a result of that. Therefore, after 2 really successful seasons on the show, during which his character had become one of the most popular, he did something that was almost unheard of in the entertainment industry during that time. The writers of the show were informed by him that they needed to remove me from the screenplay. He went to them and told them, "This is something that I am no longer able to perform." The authors were utterly taken aback by the news. They pleaded with him to remain, telling him how well liked he was and what the potential implications of this post could be for his future. However, Johnny had already made up his mind. As a result, his character, Halfsack, was sadly killed off on the show in 2009, bringing an end to his stint on production. Johnny came to the conclusion that he required a break from acting on a serious level when he left Sons of Anarchy. He desired to direct his efforts towards something that was more intimate, something creative, that was wholly and fully his own unique creation. He had the desire to compose a novel. It was originally planned that the novel would be about a young musical prodigy who was attempting to find his place in the world. In order to accomplish this, he was aware that he required a serene and calm location where he could concentrate without being distracted by the activities that were taking place in Hollywood. In order to find out if anyone knew of a location similar to that, he began doing some asking around and chatting to his pals. The writer's villa was a location that was mentioned at the time by his photographer. This stunning, expansive home with 6 bedrooms was available for rent and was situated just outside of Hollywood. It was known as the writer's villa. It had developed a reputation over the years as a type of haven for aspiring artists, performers, and authors who were still attempting to find their big break. This reputation had been earned over the course of many years. Kathy Davis, who was 81 years old at the time, was the proprietor, and she was the primary reason for this reputation. Kathy was a very nice and kind-hearted woman who had a deep understanding of how challenging and isolating it could be to pursue one's dreams in the Hollywood industry. She was responsible for the well-being of those who remained in her home. She would prepare meals for them, provide transportation for them if they required it, and she would frequently stay up late, simply listening to their expressions of anger and providing a shoulder to weep on when they were not given a part that they desired. A significant number of her previous tenants, who went on to achieve enormous success in the entertainment industry, would later claim that the time they spent with Kathy at the villa was, at the very least, partially responsible for their achievement. When they thought back on it, they recalled it as a moment that was therapeutic and relaxing, a quiet in the storm that was the industry. In spite of the fact that Johnny had already achieved his major success, he was enamored with the concept of residing in such a tranquil location, a location that appeared to be geared toward eccentric and artistic individuals just like him. As a result, Johnny called Kathy in April of 2009 and inquired as to whether or not she had a room available. Obviously, she stated that it was a given. There is a crimson suite on the 2nd floor that you are welcome to stay in. Following his move into the writer's villa, Johnny shared with his pals that it exceeded his expectations in terms of its level of awe and wonder. Furthermore, Kathy, in particular, lived up to the expectations that had been set by everyone. The elderly landlady and he became fast friends almost immediately after meeting each other. For a period of time, it appeared that everything was going according to Johnny's plan. His life was heading in the direction that he truly desired it to go. His life then took an unexpected turn just a few months later, but that was not the case. The news that his girlfriend, Diane, was expecting a child came to him. Johnny was truly pleased at the prospect of being a father, despite the fact that this entirely altered his intentions for finishing his work. In a responsible manner, he made the decision to act. He left the tranquil villa and moved in with Diane, who lived in the neighborhood, so that he could be present to assist with the care of their child. In the year 2010, on April 6th, Diane gave birth to a healthy baby girl whom they called Cullame. This occurred 9 months subsequently. Upon the birth of their daughter, Johnny and Diane fell head over heels in love with her. Unfortuitously, the pressures of fatherhood caused their love for each other to diminish rapidly, which negatively impacted their relationship. Within a short period of time, their relationship had deteriorated to the point where Johnny decided to leave, and this time he went back to live with his parents. Johnny and Diane were involved in a custody battle over their daughter, Culla May, that was extremely violent, drawn out, and excruciating. This conflict began not long after the collapse of their relationship. Johnny was ultimately unsuccessful in the fight, which lasted for several months. He was completely and utterly devastated by the verdict that the court made. Around a few months later, in October of 2011, Johnny was still residing at his parents' home, and he was experiencing feelings of disorientation and depression. For the sole purpose of going for a ride and attempting to get his thoughts organized, he made the decision to ride his motorcycle one day. To the west of Los Angeles, he traveled for around 2 hours, and then he continued on into the desert. It was at that moment that he lost control of his motorcycle and came to a crash. He was transported to the hospital, where it was initially discovered that his injuries were not quite as severe as one might expect. The medical professionals were a little worried that he might have suffered a brain injury, but after conducting a series of tests, they found that he did not have a concussion. He was released home after they assured him that he was fine. Nevertheless, he was not in good health when he returned home from the hospital. As a matter of fact, he was an entirely different individual. Michael, Johnny's father, was the first person to pick up on the significant behavioral shift that his son had undergone. Johnny has recently appeared to be behaving in a really strange and irregular manner. In addition to being agitated and irritable all the time, his thoughts were not always cohesive, he would ramble, and he couldn't stop talking. The fact that something was gravely wrong was so clear to his family that they couldn't ignore it. Michael, his father, was perplexed by this information. It is possible that his son sustained a head injury as a result of the motorcycle accident. Maybe the medical staff at the hospital simply failed to notice it. After that, Michael made arrangements for Johnny to have 2 independent MRIs so that he could get a better look at his brain. But Johnny did not show up for either of his appointments, and he never provided an explanation for his decision. Approximately at the same time, Johnny's pals started to take notice of his peculiar behavior themselves. In December of that year, he was attending an acting class, and throughout the entirety of the session, he began speaking with an accent that was reminiscent of British. Every single person in the classroom appeared to be staring at each other as if they were perplexed by the situation. In the end, someone finally confronted him with the question, "Hey, why are you talking like that? In a state of bewilderment, Johnny simply stared at them and asked, "Like what?" In response, he simply shrugged his shoulders and pretended as if he had no idea what they were talking about. The situation became far more dire a few weeks later, on the morning of the 3rd of January 2012, when it was at its peak. Johnny was at his parents' house, where he was observing his mother as she prepared omelets. He was seated in the kitchen. The sudden appearance of Johnny, who suddenly rose up and announced, "I'm going to go out for a walk," came out of nowhere. He stands up, and the only thing he is wearing is his pajamas. He is not even wearing shoes at this point. He exits the house by the front door, and as he is heading down the road, he is approximately 10 to 15 feet away from his parents' residence. At that point, he claims to have heard someone yelling something that sounded like they were in a great deal of anguish. It occurred to him that the screams were emanating from an apartment that was situated just adjacent to the residence of his parents. In light of this, he did not hesitate before breaking into the apartment. Upon entering, however, he saw that there was no one present. Not a single person was present in the residence. At the very moment when he was standing in this vacant flat, completely bewildered, the 2 guys who owned the unit returned home. When they entered, they saw Johnny standing in the living room, and he was there alone. They informed him that he was required to leave without delay. However, rather than making his departure, Johnny did something that was entirely unexpected. He then charged at them, bashing both of them over the head with the bottle. However, they were able to tackle him, detain him, and hold him down until the police arrived. He then grabbed a glass bottle that was nearby and charged at them. Johnny claimed that he was acting in self-defense when he was questioned by the police, but the police did not believe his account for a single second. Trespassing, burglary, and assault with a deadly weapon were the charges that were brought against him, and he was taken custody of and placed in jail. A total of 8 exhausting days had passed by the time Johnny's father was eventually able to post bail and release his son from jail. The condition of Johnny had deteriorated during the course of those 8 days. The general population portion of the jail had been moved to the psychiatric unit, and he had been transferred there. The security personnel reported that he was beating his head against the concrete walls of his cell on a regular basis. He had attempted to leap off a balcony that was located on the second floor at one time. He was simply behaving in a manner that was utterly out of control. As a result, a physician working at the correctional facility had left a statement on his paperwork when he was ultimately released from jail. Based on his observations, the physician stated that he was of the opinion that Johnny must have sustained some kind of head injury at some point in time, which was the reason for his behavior. The physician also made the observation that Johnny was unquestionably suicidal. Johnny was a complete and utter mess when he arrived at his parents' place after it had been a long time. The battle that he had with the 2 men in the flat had left him with 2 black eyes, and his face was swollen and bruised as a result of the altercation that he had with them. The emotional turmoil he was experiencing was so severe that he would not allow any member of his family to even come close to him. The only thing he did was lock himself in his room and tell everyone to not come near him. A heightened sensitivity to light was another symptom that he had. The situation became so dire that he began walking around his parents' house and shutting out each and every light individually. As soon as his parents eventually turned them back on, he would become upset and angry, and then he would go and turn them all off completely again. At long last, in a moment of exasperation, he walked to the fuse box that belonged to his parents and just turned off the power completely, therefore putting the entire house into full darkness. Nevertheless, in spite of the fact that Johnny had very visible problems after returning home from jail, it appeared that he was making some progress over the course of the subsequent few weeks. Despite the fact that it was a gradual process, there were times when he appeared to be more like his previous self. His parents believed that he had made sufficient progress by the time the month of January came to a close, over a month after he had returned home, and they gave him permission to move out and live on his own once more. It took him around 30 minutes to travel to Santa Monica, California, where he discovered a place to stay. However, as soon as he moved out on his own, he began to experience difficulties once more to a greater extent. On the 10th of February, he was arrested for striking a random stranger in the head outside of a yogurt shop. This occurred only about a week after he had moved into his new house in Santa Monica. Under the terms of a bail of $20,000, he was released. After a number of days had passed, Johnny simply walked into the ocean while wearing all of his clothes. It was necessary for strangers to rescue him from the icy water, and he was then transported to the hospital to receive treatment for hypothermia upon his arrival. The second time he was taken into custody came just a few days after he had been released from the hospital. For the second time, he was apprehended while attempting to break into the apartment of a woman in Santa Monica. When he was apprehended by the authorities, he stated that he had considered the apartment to be that of his friend. However, once again, nobody believed him. Again, he was taken back to jail, and then he was released on bond before being released. Johnny's parents were finally successful in persuading him to schedule an appointment with a medical professional regarding the possible head injury they believed he had sustained as a result of the motorbike accident that occurred in 2011. This second arrest took place in Santa Monica. However, despite the fact that the doctor at the jailhouse had speculated that Johnny had sustained a head injury, he had not officially diagnosed him. Johnny needed the assistance of a second physician in order to receive a definitive diagnosis, which would allow them to finally start treating whatever ailment he was experiencing. However, the physician that Johnny ultimately went to see had a different point of view. A brain injury was not anything he suspected. As an alternative, he had a strong suspicion that Johnny was suffering from either schizophrenia or bipolar illness, both of which are quite severe mental conditions. The result was that he gave Johnny a prescription for a potent drug that would treat both of those illnesses, and then he sent Johnny on his way. Still, Johnny was adamant about not taking the prescription. His rejection was complete. In addition to this, he declined to get a second opinion from a different physician. Due to the fact that he was not receiving any therapy, his condition continued to deteriorate. There was still a significant possibility that Johnny would be sentenced to jail for the break-in and the assault that he committed against those two men in the flat that was adjacent to his parents' house. His attorney was exerting a great deal of effort in an effort to negotiate a plea bargain for Johnny in which he would be sentenced to a year of therapy at a mental health hospital rather than being sent to jail. Johnny, however, was so naive in his belief that all of the accusations would simply be dropped and that he would be let to return to his life and live the way he desired, that he decided to terminate his attorney. It was his decision to act as his own attorney in court. It turned out to be a really bad choice. His sentence of 1 year in prison was handed down by the judge, and the charges against him were not withdrawn. However, because the facility to which he was sent was so badly overcrowded, they ultimately decided to reduce his sentence to merely 6 weeks for the whole duration of his sentence. Johnny was at an all-time low when his father finally came to pick him up from prison on Friday, the 21st of September 2012. Johnny's father had been incarcerated for years. Despite the fact that he had only been incarcerated for a period of 6 weeks, rather than the entire year that he had been sentenced to, it was evident that the small amount of time that he had spent in jail had caused him a great deal of personal harm. He was emaciated, reserved, and appeared to be in rudimentary condition. Johnny turned to his father in a kind of bashful manner as they were driving back from the prison. He asked his father, "You know, Dad, would it be possible if you called Kathy Davis at the writer's villa?" Johnny's father nodded his head in agreement. "I just wanted to check and see if there was any possibility that I could move back in." It was Michael, his father, who gave it some thought for a brief while. It was something he hadn't thought about before, yet it made complete sense. The writer's villa was the final residence that Johnny had occupied during the time that his life was still in order. Most likely, that was the very last place in which he felt genuine happiness. He must have associated that location with a great deal of pleasant and tranquil recollection. It was a wonderful concept, Michael thought, and it was the ideal location for him to go to in order to make an effort to put his life back together. Michael immediately placed a phone call to Kathy Davis as soon as they returned to the house. After describing the entire scenario and everything that Johnny had been through, he inquired as to whether or not there was any possibility that he could remain there. And without a single second of doubt, Kathy responded with an unequivocal yes. It is still possible to purchase the red suite. Immediately, I will walk up to the bedroom and make the bed for him. I can't wait to meet him in person. Johnny spent the weekend with his parents, and then on Monday, September 24th, he moved back into the villa after packing up his belongings and moving back in with them. 2 days later, on the morning of September 26th, a man named Dan Blackburn, who was the next-door neighbor to the writer's villa property, was looking out his front window. Blackburn was 70 years old at the time. Along the route, he noticed a man who was standing out. The only thing the man was wearing was a pair of red sneakers and a pair of trousers. He was furiously pacing back and forth in the center of the street, he was completely drenched in sweat, and he was not wearing a shirt by any stretch of the imagination. Dan had never encountered this individual before, and his conduct was peculiar. So he just kind of watched him from behind his curtain, attempting to figure out what he was going to do next. Following around 15 minutes of this peculiar and anxious pacing in the road, the man abruptly turned and walked directly towards Dan's property where he had been standing. After walking straight up to the front steps, he began to knock on the door while he was there. In spite of the fact that Dan was feeling a little anxious, he went ahead and closed the curtain, then went to his front door and peered through the peephole into his home. The man was standing there when he noticed him. He had these brilliant blue eyes that were wide open, and he was staring at the peephole as if he could see Dan standing on the other side of it. He appeared to be able to see through it. After taking a deep breath, Dan unlocked the door and opened it slightly. He then opened it a little bit more. When he looked out, the person who was standing outside greeted him and introduced himself as John. "Hello, I am your new neighbor." It was inevitable that John would be revealed to be Johnny Lewis on the subject. The door was opened a little bit farther by Dan, who was attempting to be sociable. He then added, "Hello, John, it's nice to meet you." However, before the two men could engage in any type of genuine discourse, Johnny quickly turned around and walked away without saying a single word. At this point, Dan is left standing there, very perplexed by the peculiar interaction that he has just experienced. He observes Johnny as he simply walks back to the road, then walks back over to the writer's villa, enters the building, and then vanishes from view. In a manner that could be described as a shrug, Dan decided to close and lock his door before returning to his morning routine. Dan is in another area of his house, simply doing his own thing, when he hears his wife outside, yelling his name and urging him to come outside immediately. This happens around 30 minutes later. As soon as Dan exits the main door, he dashes into his driveway, which is the area that separates his property from the writer's villa. He notices his wife standing on the driveway, and she appears to be in complete and utter disbelief. In the direction of the back of their house, she is pointing upward. While Dan is looking in the direction that she is pointing, he notices Johnny Lewis standing close to their deck. A second man, the worker that Dan and his wife had hired that day to paint their back deck, is standing on top of Johnny. Johnny is standing on their back. This guy is getting a never-ending stream of blows from Johnny. He also has a piece of wood in his possession, which he is using to strike him. The unfortunate worker is currently lying on the ground, attempting to protect himself from the blood that is running down his body. It was just that Dan's instincts took control. He makes his way over to them. Due to the fact that Johnny is so intent on the assault, he has failed to notice Dan coming closer. Dan immediately approaches him, grabs him by the shoulder, and makes an attempt to remove Johnny from the painter's grasp all at once. Johnny is being yelled at by him to stop himself and to get off of him. On the other hand, Johnny appears to be completely unmoved. Just like a machine, he is destroying this worker from the inside out. When Dan finally pulls as hard as he can on Johnny's shoulder, Johnny finally jumps up and stands up right away. After turning around, he delivers a single punch to Dan's face, bringing him to the same level as before. Dan suffers a severe fall to the ground. Johnny is simply standing over him and looking down at him with no expression on his face. When he glances up, he sees Johnny standing over him. It appeared as though he had no idea what he was going to do with Dan in the next instance. He did nothing but stand there and stare with those eyes that were so big and vacant. On the other hand, Dan was not going to squander any time in his attempt to figure it out. Immediately after jumping back up to his feet, he struck Johnny with as much force as he could muster, delivering a blow to the side of his skull. On the other hand, Johnny was completely unaffected by the punch. At no point did he even flinch. Simply staring at Dan without making any facial expressions, he continued to look. Therefore, Dan, in a state of panic, grabbed a metal lawn chair that was nearby, and he nearly shattered it over Johnny's head to get him to sit down. Once again, however, it had little impact. Johnny did nothing but stand there, staring at Dan without forming any expression on his face. At this time, Dan was aware that he was doing nothing to win this fight. Therefore, he simply grabbed the painter, who was so weak that he could not stand up, and he assisted him in running back down the driveway. He grabbed his wife, and the three of them rushed in the direction of their home in order to go inside and be safe. The three of them were able to make their way into the house, and just as they were attempting to close the large and massive front door, Johnny came running up the stairs. At precisely the moment that they were closing the door, he arrived at the door and pushed his arm into the gap that existed between the door and the doorframe. For some reason, they were unable to shut the door because it was getting caught on his arm. So at this point, all three of the adults inside, Dan, his wife, and the injured painter, are exerting all of their combined weight on this enormous wooden door in an attempt to crush Johnny's arm. However, Johnny is only attempting to grab at them through the opening. Finally, the three of them begin to heave the door back and slam it onto Johnny's arm as forcefully as they possibly can, repeatedly. They do this over and over again. Johnny was finally able to retract his arm after being subjected to a series of powerful strikes that were crushing, and they were able to slam the door shut and lock it. It was at this time that Dan's wife and the painter went throughout the remainder of the house, making sure that every window was shut and every door was locked. They wanted to ensure that there was no other way for him to enter the house. While this was going on, Dan moved to a side window that had a view of the writer's villa property. While his eyes searched the yard for Johnny, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. He was currently hunting for Johnny. The moment he finishes explaining what is going on to the 911 operator and hangs up, Johnny suddenly materializes out of nowhere. The way he is rushing down Dan's driveway gives the impression that he is heading back towards the back deck. At that moment, however, he comes to a stop practically just in front of the window that Dan is seeing out of. He makes a turn and immediately begins to run at full speed in the direction of the villa property. When he reaches a barrier that is at least waist high, he simply leaps over it without pausing his stride in any way. After that, he arrives to this enormous wooden fence that encircled the entire area owned by the villa. This fence stood at a height of at least 8, 9, and possibly 10 feet. In a very simple and straightforward manner, he simply leaps, grabs the top, and launches himself directly over the top, vanishing within the confines of the villa's grounds. The police arrived within a few minutes of the call. In an effort to locate Johnny, they proceeded inside the villa, and the things that they discovered there were beyond their comprehension. These are the events that the investigators believe took place that morning based on the evidence that was found at the scene. Johnny had turned around after he had initially approached Dan's property and awkwardly knocked on the door, introducing himself as the new neighbor. He had then introduced himself to Dan. Dan watched him as he walked away from the grounds and made his way back inside the writer's villa while he was there. The moment Johnny entered the villa, he made his way to the second story where he entered Kathy Davis's room where she was at the time. Johnny then proceeded to the second floor. The compassionate woman, Kathy, who was 81 years old, most likely turned around and spotted Johnny standing in the doorway of her home. It appeared as though he was completely insane since he was drenched in sweat and he was not wearing a shirt. On the other hand, she most likely did not feel terrified at first. It is likely that her maternal instincts came into play. She most likely asked Johnny, "Are you okay?" or anything along those lines. "Is it possible for me to assist you? How are things going?" And while she was probably standing up and making her way over to him to make sure he was okay, Johnny proceeded to beat her, kick her, and strangle her for reasons that no one will ever understand. He did this for reasons that no one will ever understand. And then, once she had fallen to the ground and was completely defenseless, Johnny proceeded to either continuously stamp on her skull or hit her over the head with a rusty hammer that was subsequently discovered in his bedroom. Both of these actions were carried out in a manner that was quite violent. But regardless of the specific manner in which Johnny carried out his actions, he was able to cause a major fracture to her skull, which was eventually the cause of her death. Following his murder of Kathy, Johnny immediately went in search of her cherished cat and proceeded to kill the cat in the same heinous manner. After that, Johnny raced out of the villa, and it was at that moment that he must have seen Dan's house painter sitting outside studying nothing but minding his own business. While Johnny was walking over to him, he immediately started pounding him. In the same way that the awful attack on Kathy and her cat appeared to have no reason whatsoever, this attack on the house painter appeared to have no reason at all. It was utterly arbitrary and made no sense at all. Johnny waited outside for a few minutes before running down Dan's driveway after Dan came outside and was able to fight off Johnny. After Dan went back inside the home with his wife and the painter, Johnny then ran down Dan's driveway. Following that, he jumped over those two fences just in front of Dan, and then Johnny vanished back inside the villa. It is believed that once Johnny was back inside the villa property, he climbed up to an upper patio or possibly onto the roof of the villa where he was staying. From that vantage point, he proceeded to either jump or fall to his death on the concrete driveway that was located below. It has been determined that his death was not a suicide, but rather an accident. Everyone who heard the story concluded that Johnny must have been under the influence of some extremely potent narcotics after the word broke about what had occurred at the writer's villa. When it came to explaining why someone would behave in such a manner with such excessive, unjustified aggression and what appeared to be superhuman strength, that seemed to be the only plausible answer. However, the toxicology result provided by the coroner's office revealed that he did not possess any drugs, whether they were legal or illicit, in his system. This was the case regardless of the type of substance. At the time that he did this heinous murder, he was absolutely free of any alcohol or drugs. Because of the motorbike accident, there are some individuals, including his family, who are of the opinion that Johnny actually did suffer from a significant head injury that was not properly diagnosed. They are of the opinion that this brain injury is the cause of his violent outbursts, as well as the entire transformation of his personality. There are those that disagree. People believe that the head damage explanation does not adequately explain everything. They are of the opinion that Johnny had a mental condition that was not properly diagnosed. It's possible that it was schizophrenia, or it could have been bipolar disorder, or it could have been something else different. However, this mental condition was the root cause of the psychosis that resulted in these violent outbursts among the individuals. No one, however, is able to definitively explain why Johnny Lewis acted in the manner that he did. The only thing that we know for certain is that a woman who was nice and innocent, as well as her beloved pet, has been cruelly and needlessly murdered, and that a story that started out with Hollywood hopes has ended up being a nightmare that cannot be explained. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?